Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene. Settle in for a little while. Get comfortable in whatever way comfort works best for you. Maybe that means a blanket pulled up to your chin. Maybe it means one foot sticking out, because apparently that is how the human body negotiates with sleep. Maybe you are listening from bed, from a sofa, from a chair you absolutely did not mean to fall asleep in, or from a place where the day is just beginning and the light outside still looks undecided. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Tonight, we are heading toward cold water, rough weather, and one of those real events from history that sounds almost too severe to be true when you first hear it. Our subject is the Armistice Day Storm, the deadliest storm in Great Lakes history, a storm that arrived with the confidence of something that had already made up its mind long before anyone else understood what was coming. It crossed the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes in November of 1940, and it left behind wrecked ships, flooded marshes, broken forecasts, and an astonishing number of people who woke to one kind of day and found themselves, by afternoon, in another entirely. That shift is part of what makes this story so unsettling. It was not a day that announced itself properly at first. It did not begin like a warning poster. It did not step out wearing a villain's coat and introduce itself with thunder and flashing lightning and a sign that said, in effect, "Excuse me, but I am here to rearrange your plans and possibly your understanding of weather." It began in a way that seemed manageable to many people, reasonable even. It was a holiday. It was late autumn. It was a day for work, for travel, for hunting, for crossing water, for ordinary decisions that only look tragic after history gets to edit the page. And that is often the hardest part of stories like this. The people inside them do not know they are in a story yet. They are making coffee. They are buttoning coats. They are checking boats, talking to friends, loading gear, glancing at the sky, and deciding whether the weather looks annoying or serious. Most of us do the same thing all the time. We stand in a doorway, look up, and make a little private bargain with the day. Is this a light jacket situation? Is this a regret your shoes situation? Is this weather real? Or is it just trying to make an impression? So before we go any further, let me ask you something very simple. Where are you listening from tonight? What does the air outside feel like where you are? Is it cold enough that the windows hold a little chill, or warm enough that the world still feels open? Maybe there is rain against the glass. Maybe there is nothing at all, just the hum of a room and the low confidence of a building settling into the night. However it is around you, keep that feeling nearby for a moment, because this story begins with people doing exactly what we do. They looked at the day in front of them and tried to judge it. If you find this kind of slow journey into history soothing, if you enjoy these quiet dives into the stranger corners of the real world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps Life Beyond Scene grow, and it lets me keep making these long, calm explorations for people who like their history with a softer landing. And if you already do that regularly, then you are the sort of person every channel quietly hopes for and never deserves quite enough, so thank you. Now, Armistice Day, as it was known then, carried its own kind of meaning before the weather stole the date. November 11th had been established to mark the end of the First World War, and by 1940 it was already a day with memory attached to it. The date held ceremony, routine, public life, private habits. There would have been gatherings, errands, work, travel, holidays observed in different ways by different people. And over that familiar framework came weather that changed fast enough and hard enough to expose how limited forecasting still was, how dangerous the Great Lakes could become, and how thin the line really is between a rough day and a fatal one. It is easy now, from the comfort of hindsight, to imagine that nature should always give us a fair amount of notice. Not perfect notice, perhaps, but enough. A decent warning. A raised eyebrow from the sky. A bit of dramatic music from nowhere. Something. Yet weather does not arrange itself around our need for neat transitions. It can move from inconvenient to lethal with very little concern for whether people have caught up. 1 hour invites confidence, the next hour punishes it. A lake that looked stern but manageable in the morning can begin, by afternoon, to behave like a machine built to break wood, steel and bone. The Great Lakes, of course, are often described as lakes, which is accurate in the same way calling a cathedral a room is accurate. The word is not wrong, but it does not prepare you properly. They are inland, yes, but their scale changes the whole relationship. They create their own weather, support massive shipping routes, and demand from anyone who works them a respect that sounds, in old accounts, a lot like fear wearing professional clothes. Sailors, captains, fishermen, dock workers, hunters moving through marsh country, all of them knew these waters could turn savage. Even so, knowledge is not the same thing as timing, and experience is not the same thing as a warning system that can tell you exactly when the day will stop negotiating. By 1940, forecasting had improved from the wild guessing of earlier centuries, but it was still far from what we're used to now. There was no constant satellite view, no phone lighting up in your hand with a severe weather alert while you're standing in a grocery store wondering whether you need onions. There were maps, observations, pressure readings, radio reports, trained people doing serious work with the tools they had, and yet there were still gaps wide enough for disaster to walk straight through. The Armistice Day Storm became one of those moments when those gaps could no longer be treated as technical inconveniences. They had bodies attached to them, names, families, routes that were never finished, and still, for many people that morning, none of this would have felt inevitable. That is another thing worth holding on to as we move into the story. The day did not begin under a single uniform sky. Conditions varied from place to place. In some areas, the weather seemed mild enough, even pleasant by November standards. In others, there were signs that something stronger might be forming. But the overall mood among many people was not one of alarm. That matters because it shaped choices, and choices shaped survival. There were duck hunters out in the marshes and on the lakes, many of them taking advantage of the holiday. Hunting on Armistice Day was a tradition for some, and the conditions at first did not force everyone back to shore. Boats went out. Men spread into blinds. Dogs worked through reeds and cold water. Equipment was loaded as if the day would be hard, perhaps, but ordinary hard, not historic hard. Not stand in the middle of it and lose track of how bad it can still get hard. On the lakes themselves, ships were moving cargo through a season already known for difficult weather. November on the Great Lakes is not gentle. It has a reputation for a reason. Cold air, stronger systems, fast changes, steep waves, freezing spray, violent winds, all of this was part of the annual character of those waters. Mariners knew that November demanded caution. But again, caution depends on what you think is coming, and if the information is incomplete or misleading, people may prepare for a fight and find themselves in a collapse instead. There is something almost cruel about days like that. Not melodramatic, just cruel in a plain, practical sense. A man leaves home dressed for bad weather, and still is not dressed for this weather. A captain secures a vessel against a storm, and still not against this storm. A hunter takes a boat suitable for cold water and still not for this water, under this sky at this hour. The difference between prudent and doomed can be smaller than anyone likes to admit. And because this is a sleep story as much as a history story, let us move through it slowly. There is no need to rush ahead to wreckage just because we know it is there. In fact, the force of what happened only becomes clear if we let the day build the way it built for the people inside it. Weather stories are often told backward. We start with the destruction because destruction is dramatic and easy to summarize. But a storm is not only the damage it leaves, it is also the morning before, the confidence before, the mistaken forecast, the casual remark, the delayed departure, the decision to continue, the sky that does not yet look like a threat, and then, very suddenly, does. You can almost picture some of those early scenes. A dock with men moving in heavy clothes, not cheerful exactly, but capable and used to cold. A shoreline where somebody squints toward open water and says something practical. Not poetry, not prophecy, just ordinary human sound. Maybe. Looks alright for now, maybe. We've seen worse. Maybe, let's get moving before it changes. The kinds of sentences that history can turn into ghosts afterward. It is tempting too to imagine that people in the past were careless in ways we no longer are. That is one of modern life's favourite little vanity projects. We assume that because we possess better tools, we would also possess better judgment. Sometimes we do, sometimes we simply make mistakes with more advanced equipment. The people on the Great Lakes in 1940 were not foolish because they lacked an app with a radar loop. Many were experienced, cautious and familiar with the region. They were operating in the world as it existed, using the information available, and that is what makes the story feel so immediate. Remove the old clothing and the period details, and the basic structure is still familiar. People rely on forecasts. Forecasts are sometimes wrong. Nature does not grade on effort. And then there is the lakeside weather itself, which can be deceptive in a very specific way. Large bodies of water hold heat differently than land. Air masses move, collide and reorganize. Pressure changes matter. Wind direction matters. Temperature matters. Timing matters, especially when a developing storm system gathers strength and speed in the wrong way at the wrong moment over the wrong geography. On the Great Lakes, that combination can create conditions severe enough to overwhelm boats, trap people far from shelter, and turn a landscape of work and recreation into an emergency zone spread across hundreds of miles. The Armistice Day Storm did exactly that. It intensified quickly. Winds rose with extraordinary force, temperatures dropped, rain turned to sleet and snow in places, waves built to punishing heights, boats capsized, ships were driven into desperate situations, men in marshes found themselves stranded by water, cold, and wind so intense that the ordinary logic of getting back to shore began to fail. Rescue became difficult, then impossible in some places until much later. By the time the scale of the disaster was fully understood, the storm had already made its claim. But we are not there yet. Not quite. For the moment, keep the scene before the break. A holiday morning. November air. The Great Lakes region moving through a day that did not yet seem historic to everyone involved. A world in which many people still believed they knew the terms of the weather well enough to continue. That confidence did not come from arrogance alone. Sometimes it came from routine, sometimes from necessity. Ships had schedules, men had work, hunters had plans. Travel does not stop just because the atmosphere is in an argumentative mood. There is also a broader tension sitting quietly underneath the whole event. By 1940, modern life had already trained people to trust systems more than instinct. Not completely, of course. People still read the sky, watched birds, felt the air, listened to older experience. But forecasts, communications, professional observations, these had begun to shape decision-making in a stronger way. When those systems worked, they saved people. When they faltered, they sometimes gave confidence a polished surface it had not earned. That is one reason this storm stayed in memory. It was not only violent, it was instructive in the harshest possible way. It exposed how many different vulnerabilities could line up at once. Geography, weather science, communication, timing, seasonal habits, human confidence, all of them met on the same day. And because the Great Lakes occupy that strange category of being inland and still fully capable of maritime catastrophe, the event sits at the edge of several worlds at once. It is a weather story, a shipping story, a hunting story, a regional story, and in the end, a story about what happens when ordinary life keeps going for just a little too long under conditions that are no longer ordinary. That is where the unease begins to gather. Not in the height of the waves yet, not in the desperate rescues, not in the headlines that came later, but here, in the part where people are still moving forward under assumptions that will soon fail them. A storm becomes frightening long before its worst hour, though the people beneath it may not notice the moment that change takes place. There is no bell, no clean dividing line, just a series of small misreadings, late corrections, and a sky that is already becoming something else while the day continues as planned. So let us move closer to that morning. Let us step onto the edge of the holiday before the violence fully arrived. The air is cool, but not impossible. The water is watchful. Men are preparing to go out because that is what they meant to do when they woke. Others are already underway, already committed to routes and schedules that cannot be turned around lightly. Somewhere, forecasts have offered more reassurance than they should have. Somewhere else, somebody is uneasy but not yet alarmed. The kind of unease you could still dismiss with a shrug, with a joke, with that very human sentence people use right before weather becomes personal, "It will probably be fine." And in a story like this, that is where the ground begins to shift. Because the day that seemed merely changeable is about to show what November on the Great Lakes can do when the wind stops behaving like weather and starts behaving like force. Now, if we stay with that morning a little longer and resist the temptation to run ahead to the wreckage, what we find first is not panic at all. We find a day that looked manageable. In many places, it looked better than manageable. Armistice Day in 1940 began with blue skies and temperatures in the 40s and 50s across parts of the upper Mississippi River Valley, and the forecast that morning called for colder weather and a few flurries, not the kind of event that would soon be remembered across several states for shipwrecks, blizzard conditions and mass loss of life. That is worth sitting with, because history is much easier to respect when it starts in an ordinary way. A disaster that arrives under black skies from the first minute feels dramatic, but it does not feel especially human. This one did. It came into a day that had routines attached to it. Armistice Day was already a date people recognised, observed and used. Some had the day off. Some had plans set long before dawn. Some intended to hunt, some to travel, some to work, and some simply to make use of a late autumn day that, at first glance, seemed almost generous for November. You can picture the beginning of it without much effort. Houses warming slowly from the night, coats being chosen, or in some cases not chosen carefully enough. Coffee poured into heavy cups. Doors opening onto air that felt cool, yes, but not punishing. But not the sort of morning where a person steps outside, looks around and thinks, "All right then, this will do." Not perfect, perhaps. A little brisk. But certainly not the kind of morning that suggests the atmosphere is preparing a lesson in humility. The men heading for the marshes along the Mississippi had every reason to think the day was workable. Accounts from the Weather Service later noted just how pleasant the start felt, and that some duck hunters rushed out in short-sleeved shirts because the early conditions seemed so mild. That detail has survived for a reason. It is not just vivid. It is also painful in hindsight. It tells you immediately how far the day still had to fall. A person does not set out in shirt sleeves because he expects to fight gale-force winds, ice and water cold enough to turn delay into a death sentence. He does it because the morning has made a promise it does not intend to keep. The hunters themselves were not unusual figures in this story. Armistice Day hunting was a tradition for many people in the region. Marshes, river edges, blinds, flat-bottomed boats, decoys, dogs, guns, thermoses, lunch wrapped and packed with practical care. All of that belonged to the season. There is an entire social world around a hunting morning, even a cold one. Men meet before dawn, or near it. There are remarks about the weather, about whether the birds are moving, about who is late, about who has forgotten something obvious. Somebody always acts as if this is all more casual than it is, and somebody else quietly brings the item that everyone will need later. A strong day outdoors often begins like that, not with heroics, but with routine competence. The tragedy of the Armistice Day Storm is that routine competence could not carry people through what was building. Meanwhile, farther east, the Great Lakes were already supporting the other half of the story. Ships were moving cargo because shipping seasons do not pause simply to respect the emotional preferences of people on shore. November on the Great Lakes was always serious business. Mariners knew the lakes could change fast and hit hard, especially in late autumn, and yet cargo still had to move. The storm that morning was not yet presenting itself to every captain in the form it would later take. On Lake Michigan, Conditions early in the day included increasing southeast winds, and some captains kept their vessels near the east shore. That made practical sense under the conditions they believed they were facing. The disaster came later, when the wind shifted suddenly to powerful southwest gales and trapped some ships in positions where they could neither safely run with the storm nor comfortably face into it. That is one of the hardest things about weather over large water. You're often making decisions not against what the sky is doing now, but against what it may do a few hours from now, and those are not always the same contest. A lake can look stern but readable in the morning, and then become another thing entirely once the pressure drops, the wind veers, and the waves begin building in the wrong direction. By the time that change becomes obvious, a ship may already be committed. A hunter may already be too far from easy shelter. A fisherman may already be out in water that will not forgive a delay. Still, on the holiday morning itself, a great many people were not yet thinking in those terms. They were thinking in smaller, more reasonable units. The birds might fly well today. The trip should be all right if they get moving now. The Weather Bureau said colder, yes, but that is November talking. Perhaps some flurries later. Nothing impossible. Perhaps someone pulled on a heavier coat and felt faintly overcautious. Perhaps someone else laughed at him for it. That kind of teasing has probably existed for as long as people have had weather and friends. It also mattered that the morning's deceptive calm was attached to a real meteorological setup that had not yet played out at the surface in a way ordinary people could easily read. The storm system deepened rapidly as it moved northeast from around Kansas City through the upper Mississippi River Valley and toward the upper Great Lakes. Barometric pressure readings reached record lows in several places, including La Crosse and Duluth, and the lowest US pressure associated with the storm was later recorded at Houghton, Michigan. Those numbers sound technical when read from a report, but in practical terms they describe an atmosphere reorganizing itself with unusual force. The trouble was that many people enjoying the morning were still living under the last comfortable version of the day, not the next one. Forecasting in 1940 was serious work, but it was not modern forecasting. There were no satellites feeding constant images of cloud structure into every possible screen. No phone alert would chime in a hunter's pocket while he adjusted a boat line. No neat radar app would allow someone to stand in a warm kitchen and say, with perhaps too much confidence, that the front should be here by 1:30. Weather officials had observations, instruments, communication networks, maps, and experience. And yet the warning picture that morning did not communicate the full speed and severity of what was on the way. Later reviews of the storm pointed directly to this failure and to the broader forecasting reforms that followed. So the human side of the morning becomes easier to understand once you keep that in mind. People were not all ignoring obvious danger. Many were responding to the danger they believed existed, not the danger that was about to arrive. There is a difference between going out in rough November conditions knowingly and going out under a forecast that implies inconvenience when the reality is on its way to becoming catastrophic. The distance between those two things can be measured in miles per hour, in degrees of temperature drop, in hours of daylight remaining, and, in the worst cases, in lives. For hunters, the setting itself could encourage confidence. The Mississippi backwaters and marshes do not always announce their risk in theatrical terms. On a mild start, they can feel open and workable, even inviting if you know them well. Waterfowl hunters were used to cold, wet, and discomfort. They expected mud, wind, aching hands, and long waits. They were not setting out for leisure in the soft modern sense. They were doing something that already required toughness. That background can make a person more resilient, but it can also narrow the gap between what feels merely difficult and what is truly unsafe. If you are used to hard days, you may stay too long into a deadly one because at first, it still resembles the kind of hardship you have handled before. Out on the ships, experience cut both ways too. Great Lakes crews knew bad weather. Captains had handled storms, shifting seas, icing, and violent late-season blows. The very fact that they continued operating in November tells you they were not timid men. But experience can only work with the conditions it can identify. The marine accounts from the National Weather Service make the sequence painfully clear. Early winds from the southeast encouraged some vessels to favour the east shore of Lake Michigan. Later, once the winds shifted to strong southwest gales, the position that had seemed reasonable became dangerous. 3 freighters foundered off Pentwater near Luddington: the William B. Davok, the Annecy Minch, and the Novadoc. Other vessels were grounded, damaged, or narrowly saved. Yet all of that still belongs to later in the day. In the morning, the mood is something else. It is practical. It is busy. It is full of small decisions. A man deciding whether to bring 1 pair of gloves or 2. Someone checking a motor and assuming the main trouble will be the usual trouble. Another person noting the sky and deciding they have enough time. Those choices are never dramatic when they are made. They become dramatic only after the weather changes, when every little judgment acquires the awful glow of hindsight. That is why the early hours matter so much in telling this story properly. Without them, the storm becomes a monster from nowhere, which is not really how such days work. It was not nowhere, it was forming, deepening, and moving with increasing force across a region that had already put on its boots and gone outside. The air pressure was falling. The front was coming. The structure of the atmosphere had already become dangerous. But danger at a synoptic scale is not the same thing as danger in a man's immediate senses at 7 in the morning. He feels air, light, maybe a little dampness, maybe an edge to the wind. He does not feel the full pressure map. He does not feel Houghton's future reading in his bones. And even when signs do begin to appear, people often interpret them through the day they already expected. A breeze becomes a stronger breeze. Clouds become weather moving in. Colder air becomes exactly what the forecast mentioned. A little rain is just rain for a while. Human beings are excellent at fitting new discomfort into old expectations, at least until that becomes impossible. This is useful for getting through life. It is less useful when the atmosphere has decided to change categories altogether. There is something else quietly unsettling about holiday weather, and that is the way it catches extra people outside. On an ordinary workday, some of the hunters would not have gone. Some of the travel patterns would have been different. Armistice Day made time available. It made a Monday feel, for some, like a chance. That widened the storm's reach. More men in marshes, more recreational boats and hunting parties exposed to fast-changing conditions. More people leaning on the mildness of the morning and the social confidence that comes when many others are making the same choice at the same time. It is easier to believe a day is safe when parking areas are full, boats are launching, and nobody around you appears especially alarmed. By late morning, that quiet social reassurance began to fray. The strong cold front moved through during the late morning and early afternoon. Behind it, conditions changed with speed and severity. Rain turned to sleet, and then to driving snow in many areas. Temperatures dropped hard, reaching the single digits by the following morning in some places. Winds increased into gale force over the water, and into blizzard conditions over land. But before all of that became fully obvious, there would have been a period of confusion, the awkward middle ground in which the day stops matching the plan, but has not yet fully explained how bad it intends to become. That middle ground is often where the worst decisions happen, not because people are foolish, but because they are trying to preserve the logic of the morning. A hunter may wait a little longer, hoping the squall will pass. A boatman may try to finish one more run. A crew may hold course, because turning itself carries risk, and because the latest information still does not fully justify panic. No one wakes up hoping to make the wrong choice. Usually they are trying to make the least bad choice from inside a situation that is worsening faster than their information. Somewhere along the marshes, dogs would still have been working in reeds as the air sharpened. Somewhere, decoys that floated quietly at dawn would begin to jerk and slap against rougher water. Somewhere, a man who had started the day with bare forearms would finally pull on extra layers too late to change the larger problem. Along the lakeshore, lines would have creaked harder, decks grown slicker, and the first serious doubts begun to move through crews who had seen enough weather to recognise when a day was becoming stubborn in the wrong way. The shift itself could feel almost rude in its speed. One account after another from storms like this carries the same basic emotional pattern. The day seemed all right, then it seemed unpleasant, then it ceased to behave like an ordinary day at all. That sequence is more frightening than a constant storm because it pulls confidence away in stages. First it lets you go out, then it lets you continue, then it changes the rules while you're already committed. This is also where the Great Lakes and the inland storm story begin to join together. The same system that would hammer Lake Michigan with shifting gales and wreck ships was also driving blizzard conditions and deadly exposure across the upper Midwest. Hunters along the Mississippi would be trapped by threatening waves, ice and wind. On land, motorists would be stalled by drifting snow. In agricultural areas, livestock and poultry would suffer on a huge scale. It was not a single neat disaster in one place. It was a broad regional event with different forms of danger, all tied to the same rapidly intensifying storm. But on the holiday morning before the worst of it, none of those categories existed yet in the minds of the people inside the day. There were only the local versions of reality. A man in a blind thinking about birds, a shipmaster thinking about water and wind, a family at home assuming the weather might turn raw later because November often does, a forecast office doing its best with the tools of its time. The future had already begun bearing down on them, but the morning still looked like a morning, and that may be the most chilling thing about it. Because once the front arrives for real, the tone of the whole story changes. The talk gets shorter, the choices get worse. Familiar water starts moving like a threat. Air that felt merely cool turns sharp enough to punish wet clothes and open skin. What was a holiday morning becomes a survival problem, then a rescue problem, and then, in too many places, a recovery problem. The calm part of the day does not vanish all at once. It gets pushed backward, mile by mile, gust by gust, until people realise they have been overtaken, and that is where the next stretch of this story begins, with the sky no longer looking harmless, the wind beginning to insist, and the weather finally showing that it has changed its mind. At first, the change would not have announced itself like a grand event. It would have arrived in the ordinary way weather often does, by making small corrections to a day people had already judged. The light that had seemed open and manageable began to flatten. The air that felt merely cool took on a sharper edge. A breeze became the sort of wind that asks for more attention than you meant to give it. Nothing about that first shift needed to look historic. In fact, that is often how serious weather gets close to people. It does not begin by shouting, it begins by editing. Out in the marshes and on the backwaters, men who had started the morning comfortably enough would have noticed the first signs in practical ways. The surface of the water changed. Small ripples lost their softness and started moving with more purpose. Decoys no longer sat with that easy, gentle bob they had at dawn. Reeds bent farther and stayed bent. A hat needed a firmer hand. A coat that had been hanging open an hour earlier was pulled closed and buttoned higher. Somebody probably said something very sensible and understated, because that is what people do when conditions begin to turn. Not panic. Just a sentence with half its concern tucked away inside it. It is picking up. We should keep an eye on this. That sort of thing. And there is a specific discomfort in weather that worsens during the day rather than being bad from the start. If the morning is already miserable, everyone enters it with the proper attitude. Expectations are adjusted, plans are shortened, people prepare themselves. But a day that starts mild and then changes has a nasty little advantage. It gets you moving first, it gets you committed, it lets you spread out across water and marsh and shoreline, it allows you to become busy. By the time the weather asks to be taken seriously, the world is already full of people who are not standing near their own front doors anymore. That morning on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1940, the sky over parts of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region was beginning to trade its early politeness for something more forceful. The storm system was deepening fast, pressure was dropping, the front was moving. None of that would have meant much to a man in a blind unless he had a weather map in his pocket and a talent for reading it over coffee, which, to be fair, would be a very specialised hobby. What he could see instead was simpler and more immediate. The air looked less friendly. The wind had become pushy. The kind of rawness that belongs to late autumn was arriving with more confidence than expected. There is something stern about November weather in that part of the country, even on an ordinary year. The season has already stopped pretending to be gentle. The leaves are down or nearly so. The ground is tired. The open water carries a chill that never feels casual. By that point in the year, people know cold is no longer a visitor. It has moved in. But there are still levels to it. There is normal November hard weather, the kind a person can work through with enough layers and stubbornness. And then there is weather that goes beyond inconvenience and starts stripping away your margin for error. The Armistice Day Storm crossed that line quickly. As the front approached and then began passing through, the first thing many people noticed was probably the speed of the change. That is what leaves a mark in memory. Not just that it got worse, but that it got worse faster than it should have. A day can feel threatening in a broad, familiar way and still catch people off guard when the threat sharpens all at once. Rain and cold are one thing, wind that swings hard, temperatures that plunge, and water that starts behaving like a different body altogether are another. On the lakes, the change would have felt larger, more physical, more immediate. Large water has a way of making weather legible through movement. Shorelines can hide things a little. Buildings soften them. Trees break them up. On a ship or in an open boat, there is no such politeness. The surface tells the truth almost at once. Early conditions may have looked merely rough enough to demand care. Then the wind shifted, and the lake stopped being difficult in the ordinary sense and began turning dangerous in the old maritime sense of the word. Waves built harder. Decks grew meaner underfoot. Spray hit with more bite. Every sound changed with it, because water under strong wind does not sound like water under mild wind. It sounds strained, heavier, as though the lake is putting weight behind every motion. That is when confidence starts becoming expensive. A man in a duck boat can accept a lot from weather if he still believes he can outlast it or outrun it. A captain can tolerate rough conditions if the behaviour of the wind and sea still fits known patterns. But trouble deepens when the usual rules begin shifting under them. The wind no longer comes from the quarter expected. The timing no longer matches the forecast. The boat that felt adequate in the morning now feels smaller in a very serious way. The distance back is the same as it was earlier, but it no longer feels like the same distance at all. One of the crueler features of that day was that it appears to have offered just enough warning to make people uneasy, but not always enough clarity to make them act early enough. That is a dangerous combination. If the sky had looked disastrous from the first hour, more men would have stayed ashore. More would have waited. More would have shortened their plans before they began. Instead, the day behaved like a poor negotiator. It gave a little, then it took much more. In marsh country, there is a point in worsening weather when the landscape itself changes character. The same water channels and reed beds that looked familiar and navigable begin to flatten into confusion under wind and spray. Distances become harder to judge. Shorelines disappear behind weather. Boats, especially smaller ones, stop feeling like transport and start feeling like compromises. If a motor fails, if oars become difficult to use, if the wind drives water over low edges, then your whole relationship with the place turns from routine to immediate. The outdoors no longer feels like a setting for the day's activity. It becomes the main problem. That would have unfolded in stages. First the remarks, then the extra button fastened, then the realization that the birds are no longer the interesting part of the day. Then the little pause while someone decides whether to leave now or wait 10 minutes. Human beings are very fond of 10 minutes. We grant it all kinds of authority it has not earned. 10 more minutes to see if it passes. 10 more minutes to finish up. 10 more minutes because going back now feels premature. In ordinary life, this often works out. In a fast-moving storm, 10 minutes can become a habit of misjudgment. Back on shore, or in towns not yet fully caught in the worst of it, the sky likely looked unsettled in a way people recognised but did not yet fully respect. Clouds thickened. The light turned less useful. The day lost that mild holiday quality and began hardening into something more severe. A person indoors may still have thought in terms of bad weather arriving. A person already outside was beginning to understand that bad weather had arrived and was still improving itself. There is a very specific kind of discomfort in realising the forecast has undersold a day. It produces irritation first because irritation is easier to manage than fear. A person thinks this was supposed to be colder later, not like this. Or perhaps they said flurries, and this is already more than flurries. Those first mental corrections matter because they are part of how the mind catches up. The weather is no longer what was promised. Fine. Perhaps it is just a little worse. Then a little worse becomes much worse. By the time the mind has revised the estimate properly, the body may already be wet, cold, and committed to a difficult return. And cold changes the logic of everything. Mild error in fair weather can remain mild. Mild error in freezing weather begins multiplying. Wet gloves matter more. Delay matters more. Direction matters more. A boat ride that is inconvenient at 45 degrees becomes dangerous at temperatures sliding lower under strong wind. The body sheds confidence faster when it sheds heat. Hands stop cooperating. Judgment grows blunt around the edges. Tasks that seemed simple become annoyingly stubborn. Then they become frighteningly slow. That hard turn was part of the storm's power. It did not only bring wind, it brought a fast deterioration in the kind of cold that punishes exposure. Rain gave way to sleet and snow in many areas. Air that had felt merely seasonal became severe enough that being out in it, especially while wet, was no longer a matter of endurance alone. It was becoming a matter of time. For the men in the marshes, that meant the day's purpose was beginning to collapse. Hunting requires stillness, patience, attention, and a degree of comfort with waiting. Strong storm conditions ruin that arrangement almost immediately. Wind scrambles bird behaviour. Water becomes hard to manage. Sleet in the face is poor company. The practical business of staying upright, keeping gear in the boat, controlling the dog, and figuring out the route back replaces everything else. The outing stops being about whether the birds are moving and starts being about whether the boat is. On the Great Lakes, the same system was writing a harsher version of that sentence over much larger water. Ships that had already made sensible decisions based on early conditions found those decisions undermined by the storm's later wind shift and intensity. That is one of the reasons the event remained so widely discussed. It was not merely that weather became rough, it was that weather became rough in a way that changed the meaning of earlier choices. A route that seemed conservative in the morning could become exposed in the afternoon. The lake had, quite literally, changed its mind, though of course the lake itself had no mind at all, only physics and momentum, and the inconvenient habit of behaving exactly as large water behaves when driven hard enough by a rapidly deepening storm. Still, that phrasing feels right in a human sense. The sky began to change its mind. The day withdrew its earlier friendliness. The world people thought they had stepped into after breakfast was replaced by another one before afternoon had settled properly. There is a psychological strain in that kind of shift. The body has been prepared for one kind of effort and is suddenly asked for another. The emotions lag. Some part of the mind keeps expecting the day to return to what it was an hour ago. It does not. Somewhere out there, no doubt, someone tried to joke his way through the first serious gusts. That is a very human skill, and often an admirable one. People make little jokes in bad weather because humour lets them feel they still have room. A hat trying to leave for Wisconsin, a dog with better instincts than the men, coffee that has become decorative rather than useful. These things probably existed in some form that day, but humour can only live comfortably beside danger for so long. Once the weather begins taking equipment, balance and visibility with it, the jokes dry up and practical speech takes over. Practical speech is one of the clearest signs that the day has changed. Fewer words, more direct ones. Hold that. Get in. Start it now. Tie this. Keep low. Go. When weather strips conversation down to verbs, everyone understands that the atmosphere is no longer background scenery. Visibility would have narrowed as the precipitation increased and the sky thickened. Over land, roads and open country become harder to read under sleet and snow. Over marsh and open water, even more so. The horizon that helps orient a person starts fading. Shorelines blur. Wind-driven water and snow make the world feel smaller while the problem itself grows larger. And when the visual world shrinks, people often make the very understandable mistake of focusing on the next immediate task and losing track of the larger system around them. Get to that bend, reach that shore, start that motor, find that channel. Useful goals, all of them, but the storm is not waiting politely while you complete them. Another problem in weather like this is that bad conditions rarely arrive one at a time. Wind alone is one problem, cold alone is another, water alone is another still. Put them together and they begin helping each other in the worst possible way. Wind drives spray. Spray soaks clothing. Cold punishes wet clothing. Rough water slows movement. Delayed movement extends exposure. Exposure reduces strength. Reduced strength makes every task take longer. Weather becomes a system of compounding insults. That is likely the point at which many people understood, fully and without comfort, that this was no passing spell. The day was not simply turning ugly. It was reorganising itself around survival. Men who had gone out to hunt were trying to get in alive. Crews who had prepared for a blow were now facing something more dangerous and less predictable than the usual November punishment. Families at home would have started looking out windows with a different kind of concern, because by then the weather no longer resembled inconvenience, it resembled trouble. And yet, even then, there would still have been a strange resistance in the mind. A person in worsening weather often keeps hoping for a correction that never comes. The squall will ease. The wind will settle after this burst. The shoreline is closer than it looks. The cold is unpleasant but manageable. Hope in these moments is both useful and hazardous. It keeps people moving when panic would freeze them. It also sometimes delays the moment when they fully grasp how serious their position has become. This is why storms that intensify quickly have such a particular reputation. They do not only test a person's toughness, they interfere with judgment itself. The evidence is arriving, but it arrives in motion, while the person is cold, busy, and already under strain. Updating your understanding of reality is harder when reality is throwing water at your face. By early afternoon, for many in the storm's path, the change was no longer subtle. It had become force. Snow and sleet cut through the air. Winds rose into gale strength and beyond in exposed areas. Water built and broke harder. Temperatures continued to fall. The useful fiction that this was still a holiday with bad weather attached to it was collapsing. There was now only weather and whatever preparations people had managed to bring into it. That is the moment I like to linger on, not because it is dramatic in a theatrical way, but because it is so plain and human. The realization arrives without music. A person simply understands, perhaps all at once, that the day has become larger than the plan. He is no longer doing what he intended to do this morning. He is inside something else now. And once that understanding settles in, everything narrows. Home becomes a distance. Shore becomes a prize. Heat becomes an idea worth organising your body around. The storm no longer needs to prove itself. It has already done that. From here, the story moves into the men on the water, the boats in trouble, and the first desperate effort to get back from a day that had turned against them faster than anyone on shore or out among the reeds had hoped possible. To understand why the storm became so deadly, it helps to stop for a moment and look at the setting itself, because the Great Lakes in November are not just a backdrop. They're part of the machinery of the story. People call them lakes, which is true in the same way calling a freight train a vehicle is true. The description is technically correct, but it leaves out the part where size changes the rules. The Great Lakes system includes Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie and Ontario, along with their connecting waters in the St. Lawrence River, and NOAA describes it as one of the largest concentrations of fresh water on Earth, with about 95,000 square miles of water surface and roughly 11,000 statute miles of shoreline. That is not a decorative chain of inland ponds. That is a water system large enough to shape weather, shipping, work, and judgment. Once a body of water gets that large, people's instincts begin to mislead them a little. A normal lake, the sort a person drives around in an afternoon, behaves in ways that feel readable. You can see the far shore. You can judge the wind without too much imagination. Even when it turns rough, it still feels local. The Great Lakes do not always grant that comfort. Their scale means a person can be standing at the edge of a lake and dealing with something that behaves much more like open water than like the word lake encourages him to expect. That matters in November, because November is when the lakes and the air above them are often working at cross purposes, and the result can be severe weather, large waves, fast evaporation, and conditions that punish delay. NOAA notes that most of the Great Lakes' significant storms and large wave events occur during the colder months, from late fall through winter. By that time of year, the land and the water are no longer cooling at the same speed. Land gives up heat relatively quickly. Water hangs on to it longer. The Great Lakes carry a great deal of stored warmth from the summer and early autumn, and that is one reason late fall can become such an awkward season around them. Cooler, drier air starts moving over water that is still comparatively warmer, and that contrast helps drive evaporation. NOAA's Great Lakes Research Group notes that most evaporation from the lakes actually happens in the fall, precisely because cool, dry air is moving over warmer lake water. The lakes are, in a very practical sense, still releasing the memory of summer, while the atmosphere has already begun rehearsing winter. This is where November develops its unpleasant personality. It is not winter in the fully locked-in sense, at least not yet. Ice coverage is not generally doing all the work it will do later. The lakes are still exposed. The water can still feed moisture and heat into the air. Stronger seasonal storms are becoming more common. Cold air outbreaks begin dropping in with more confidence. Put all that together, and you get a time of year when a storm does not have to invent danger from scratch. The ingredients are already on the counter. The lakes provide moisture. The atmosphere provides contrast. The wind provides force. Human beings, in their usual organised way, provide schedules. That seasonal setup also explains why November weather on the Great Lakes often feels so mean, in a specific and memorable way. It is not just that it can be cold, it is that it can become raw. Wind over open water builds waves. Spray wets decks, clothing, hands and gear. Wetness in falling temperatures is one of the least charming combinations nature has produced. Add strong winds and you suddenly have a day in which ordinary working conditions begin turning into exposure problems. You're not simply cold, you are cold, wet and slowed down. The boat does not answer as cleanly. The line is hard to handle. The deck is slick. Your gloves become a bad joke. November is very good at taking a problem and assigning it to assistance. On the Great Lakes, wave growth is not just about the strength of the wind, but about how far the wind can travel over open water. In lake effect snow, NOAA explains that wind direction matters because air that travels farther over a lake can pick up more moisture. The same broad logic of fetch helps explain why certain wind setups over the lakes can be so dangerous for waves as well. More distance over open water gives the atmosphere more room to do harm. On a large lake, a long wind path is not a minor detail, it is a multiplier. This helps explain why mariners treated wind shifts seriously, and why a storm that reorganised the wind in the wrong direction could turn a bad situation into a punishing one. And that brings us to another important fact about November on these lakes. It is a month of transition, but not in the gentle brochure sense of the word. It is transition with sharp edges. The trees are mostly finished. The tourist softness is gone. Harbours, ports and shore communities are still active, but they are operating in a season that asks more from everybody. Commercial traffic continues. Recreational life has not vanished entirely. Hunters are still out. Fishermen still work. Ferries, freighters, tugs, and smaller craft are all still part of the region's movement. Yet the environment has become less forgiving, and it does not care whether your reason for being out there is profit, food, routine, or a holiday plan you set 3 days earlier. That combination of ongoing activity and worsening seasonal conditions is one reason November disasters on the Great Lakes cut so deeply into memory. The waters are not empty. People are still using them. The system is still alive with work. According to NOAA's Coast Pilot, the Great Lakes system reaches deep into the continent and supports major navigation routes far inland. This is a working water world, not a distant wilderness separated from daily life. When severe storms arrive there, they do not strike some untouched emptiness. They hit ships in motion, ports in operation, and communities tied closely to what happens on the water. There is also the simple visual problem. Great Lakes weather in November can look manageable right up until it stops being manageable. That is not because experienced people are foolish. It is because large fresh water behaves with a kind of delayed menace. A shoreline observer may see rough water and think in terms of a bad day. A person farther out may realise it has become a very bad day. By the time the two impressions catch up to each other, the conditions can already be severe. On Lake Michigan, during the Armistice Day Storm, the National Weather Service later noted that the early southeast wind led some captains to keep near the east shore, but the later shift to strong southwest gales made those positions disastrous, because vessels could neither run safely before the storm, nor easily withstand heading into the gale and high waves. That is not just a weather detail. That is November on the Great Lakes turning a reasonable earlier decision into a dangerous later one. For anyone who did not grow up around large lakes, this can be hard to appreciate at first. There is a habit, especially among people from inland areas without a Great Lake nearby, of assuming that a lake is something that remains a little more civilized than the sea. It sounds contained. It sounds domestic. It sounds like the kind of place where weather may be unpleasant but not truly maritime. The Great Lakes have always objected to that assumption. They produce serious waves, severe icing, strong coastal impacts, and marine conditions that demand professional respect. They are freshwater, yes, but they are not mild water. November makes that lesson harder because it sits at the intersection of two different seasonal truths. The first is that the lakes still hold heat and moisture compared with the cold air now moving across them. The second is that the broader atmospheric pattern is becoming more energetic, more winter-driven, and more capable of producing deep low-pressure systems, strong fronts, and forceful wind fields. That means the month can support rapid changes. You can begin in one kind of day and end in another. Air that felt merely cool in the morning can become punishing later. Rain can hand the job over to sleet and snow. A lake surface that was rough but workable can become a battering system with little interest in your timetable. The Great Lakes also affect a nearby land weather in ways people around them know almost in their bones, even if they never describe it in technical language. They moderate temperatures, they influence cloud cover, they feed lake-effect snow when cold air moves across warmer, unfrozen water. NOAA explains that lake-effect snow forms when cold air passes over warmer lake waters, picking up heat and moisture, then dropping that moisture as snow downwind. These events usually occur between November and February, which tells you something important right away. November is not just a calendar label there. It is one of the main months when the lakes start making their seasonal weather influence felt in a direct and occasionally dramatic way. And lake-effect snow is only one part of the picture. Even when a storm is not purely lake-effect in origin, the lakes can still intensify local conditions or complicate them. Moisture matters. Temperature contrast matters, wind direction matters, shoreline orientation matters, fetch matters, ice cover or lack of it matters. By late fall, there is still enough open water for the lakes to participate actively in the atmosphere's bad habits. Later in the winter, broader ice cover can reduce evaporation and damp some wave action in certain places. In November, that protective muting is often not established yet. NOAA notes that once ice has formed, it reduces evaporation and that shorebound ice can buffer waves and help protect coasts. The simple implication is that before that ice takes hold, the lakes are more exposed and more able to contribute to storms and wave damage. For mariners in 1940, none of this would have been shocking as general knowledge. The Great Lakes had long reputations. Lake November was not a new invention. Captains, crews, harbourmen, fishermen and local residents all understood in broad terms that late fall could be rough and dangerous. But broad knowledge is not precise knowledge, and November tends to exploit the difference. Knowing that storms happen is not the same as knowing this storm will deepen this fast, the wind will shift this way, the pressure will fall this far, and the high waves will arrive when you're still committed to a route chosen under earlier conditions. Familiarity can help survival, but it does not eliminate surprise. In some cases, it can even encourage a person to stay calm a little longer than is wise because the early stage still resembles difficulties he has handled before. The Armistice Day Storm took advantage of exactly that seasonal setup. The National Weather Service describes it as a powerhouse late autumn storm that impacted much of the Midwest and Great Lakes region, bringing a sharp daytime temperature drop, strong winds, blizzard conditions in parts of the upper Midwest, shipwrecks on the lakes, and 154 deaths overall, including 59 fatalities on Lake Michigan. Those numbers are stark, but they become clearer once you remember where they happened. This was not a tropical coast with palm trees and hurricane shutters. This was the Great Lakes in November, a place where a rapidly deepening storm could combine inland blizzard conditions with maritime disaster on fresh water. That combination is part of what makes the event feel so strange to people reading about it later. The words do not always sit together comfortably at first. Blizzard, freighters, duck hunters, lake waves, Midwestern holiday, maritime fatalities on inland water, and yet they all belong in the same sentence because the Great Lakes region is one of those places where weather ignores the neat boundaries in our heads. Land and water are tightly linked. A storm does not have to choose one identity. It can be several forms of trouble at once. There is also the matter of distance. The Great Lakes are large enough that help is not always close, even when shore is technically somewhere nearby. That is one of the quiet tricks of maps. They make large water look flatter and simpler than it feels from a deck or a small boat. In a storm, distance stretches. A shore that exists on paper as an obvious destination becomes something you may not safely reach. A harbour that looked available can become unreachable under the wrong wind and wave pattern. A rescue can be delayed not because nobody cares, but because the conditions are too severe for other boats to move safely into them. November does not merely produce hard weather. It produces hard weather in places where movement itself becomes unreliable, and then there is the cold. Cold deserves more respect than it usually gets in storytelling, perhaps because it seems less dramatic than flame or flood. But on the Great Lakes in late autumn, cold is not background. It is enforcement. Once the wind strengthens and the water starts breaking over decks or into smaller craft, body heat begins leaving the scene with very little sentiment. Tasks slow down, hands lose precision, wet clothing becomes a liability, decision-making narrows. A person may still be brave, skilled, determined, and entirely in trouble. November cold is not especially impressed by character. That same cold also changes what the lakes look like and how people relate to them. Summer water invites use. Autumn water asks for caution. November water often feels like something that has stopped pretending to be friendly. The colour changes. The shorelines look barer. The air carries less softness. Even on calmer days there is a sense, in many places around the lakes that the season has become serious. The local people who work them understand this well. Outsiders sometimes learn it in a single afternoon. So when we say the Great Lakes in November, we're really talking about a whole package of conditions. Enormous open fresh water, stored heat still leaving the lakes, cooler, drier air arriving overhead, more evaporation, the season of stronger storms and larger waves, limited or incomplete ice protection, heavy commercial use that has not yet fully retreated, recreational use that still lingers, cold intense enough to turn small problems into compounding ones, and a geography broad enough to make a person feel safe at breakfast and stranded by afternoon. Once that framework is in place, the tragedy of the Armistice Day Storm starts to make more sense. The storm did not create danger in an empty room. It entered an environment already primed for it. The lakes were still open, still active, still participating in the weather. The season was already unstable in the old practical way. People were still out there working, travelling, hunting, crossing, loading, steering, and assuming that the day's trouble would remain within known limits. That assumption was about to fail. Because the next part of the story is not only about wind and water, it is about what happened when forecasts, habits, and human confidence met a storm in a month that gives very little back once it has decided to take hold. And that is where the false calm starts to matter. The half-warning, the underestimation, the sense that people had prepared for trouble, only not for this exact version of it. By the time the sky had begun to harden, and the first easy assumptions of the morning were starting to wear thin, another part of the story was already in motion, and that part is less dramatic on the surface, but just as important. It lives in forecasts, in official expectations, in habits of trust, and in that very human tendency to believe that a day will continue to resemble its first few hours. On the morning of November 11th, 1940, the weather forecast called for colder temperatures and a few flurries. Instead, a rapidly deepening low-pressure system moved northeast through the upper Mississippi River Valley into the upper Great Lakes, bringing a strong cold front, a sharp daytime temperature drop, sleet, driving snow, gale-force winds, and conditions severe enough to kill 154 people across the region. That gap between forecast and reality is one of the reasons this storm stayed in memory. It was not only violent, it was badly underestimated. That underestimation matters because it shaped the mood of the day before it shaped the damage. Forecasts do more than describe the atmosphere. They set the emotional furniture of a morning. They tell people whether to hurry, whether to postpone, whether to treat the sky like a nuisance or a threat. A forecast for colder weather and a few flurries does not sound inviting exactly, but it also does not sound historic. It sounds like November behaving in a moderately annoying but familiar way. A person hearing that forecast could still quite reasonably go to work, head out hunting, launch a small boat, or continue a shipping run with the expectation that the day might get rough, but not ruinous. In other words, the forecast did not merely fail to warn, it left space for confidence, and confidence once granted is slow to withdraw. That is one of the trickiest parts of weather. When a day begins under blue skies and mild temperatures in the 40s and 50s, the body and mind settle into a certain agreement with the world. You dress one way, you pack one way, you judge risk one way. The National Weather Service account notes that the day was so nice early on that duck hunters rushed to the marshes in short-sleeved shirts. That detail has survived because it captures the whole problem in one image. A short-sleeved shirt is not a meteorological error, it is a social one. It tells you what kind of morning people believed they were standing in. There is a tendency, looking back at tragedies, to become a little too pleased with hindsight. We like to imagine we would have been the wise one at the edge of the parking lot. The person squinting at the horizon and saying, "No, absolutely not. I have seen enough old weather maps to know where this is going." This is flattering, but not always true. Most people act inside the world they are given, not the world history later reconstructs for them. On that morning, many of the people heading into danger were not ignoring a clear warning. They were responding to a forecast that understated the threat, and to conditions that, early on looked manageable. Officials later said they knew a storm was coming, but were wrong about its strength and scope. That is a very serious sentence, and also a very plain one. It does not sound dramatic, it sounds administrative. But tucked inside it are shipwrecks, stranded hunters, and families waiting for people who would not return. The false calm of that morning was not only in the forecast itself, it was built into the rhythm of the date. Armistice Day was a holiday, and holidays have a way of making ordinary judgment just a little more optimistic. People are freer to go out. Plans that might not happen on a workday suddenly happen. Hunting parties form. Travel feels worth the trouble. One bad feature of a holiday storm is that it catches extra people outside, and it catches them under a mood already shaped by leisure, tradition, or long-standing routine. Hundreds of duck hunters were out across the Midwest, and weather accounts from the National Weather Service note that many were overtaken by the storm after first being drawn by the day's mild start and by the sudden mass movement of waterfowl. The birds knew something was changing. The hunters, understandably, focused on the birds. That is such a human error that it barely feels like an error at all. You go out for ducks, and then ducks arrive in astonishing numbers, flying low everywhere at once, making the day seem suddenly worth the trip. In another context, that would be a reward. In this one, it became a distraction. The National Weather Service account says many hunters later commented that they had never seen so many birds, but the birds were moving out of the way of the approaching storm. Hunters, taken by the spectacle, failed to recognise how quickly the weather was changing. This does not mean they were naive. It means they were doing what people do when the world gives them an immediate, visible reason to keep going, while the real danger is still assembling in the background. The same pattern appeared on the water in larger form. Mariners on the Great Lakes were not casual men. They knew November had teeth. They knew storms could arrive with force, and they knew large fresh water does not become gentler simply because it is inland. Yet the storm exploited timing and wind shift in a way that turned earlier caution into later danger. The National Weather Service account of Lake Michigan explains that early in the day the wind was from the southeast and increasing, which led some captains to navigate near the east shore. Then came the sudden shift to southwest gales, and vessels that had been in what seemed like a prudent position were suddenly in terrible trouble, unable either to run before the storm or comfortably withstand heading into gale and high waves. That is one of the clearest examples of fatal misjudgment in the whole event, and it was not pure recklessness. It was a decision made under one set of conditions, then punished under another. In stories like this, misjudgment can sound harsher than it should. It implies carelessness. Sometimes carelessness is involved, certainly, but often what it really means is that people continued trusting a mental picture of the day that had already expired. Weather changes faster than belief. That is as true now as it was in 1940. The trouble is that belief does not update itself neatly in a storm. First, a person thinks the forecast is mostly right, then perhaps slightly wrong, then irritatingly wrong, then dangerously wrong. Every stage costs time. The sky never has to win an argument all at once. It only has to stay ahead of your revisions. Part of the problem in 1940 was structural. Forecasting was serious work, but it was operating with tools and staffing practices that now look painfully limited for an event of this kind. The Weather Bureau later faced criticism for failing to predict the huge blizzard. Officials admitted they had underestimated the storm. One especially damaging revelation was that no one had been watching its explosive development in the pre-dawn hours of November 11th, when the low pressure deepened by roughly 1 to 2 millibars per hour over a 24-hour period. A retired government forecaster said the Midwest headquarters in Chicago was not staffed overnight. That is one of those facts that lands with a terrible stillness, not because it explains everything, but because it explains enough. The storm was intensifying fast, and the people responsible for monitoring the region were not fully watching at the critical hour. It is also worth remembering that weather communication itself worked differently then. Rural communities did have weather information available, The National Weather Service notes that telephone operators and rural free delivery mail carriers commonly help distribute such information. In 1940, long-range forecasting had been introduced as a 5-day forecast issued twice weekly and based on upper air pressure data and comparisons to past weather patterns. That sounds almost reassuring at first, because it suggests a system trying hard to become more modern. But it also reveals how much depended on interpretation, timing, and the flow of information through human networks that were slower and more fragile than what people now take for granted. There was no instant, universal correction arriving in every pocket the moment the storm deepened more quickly than expected. If the official picture was incomplete, the public picture stayed incomplete longer, and even when information exists, people do not always absorb it in the same way. Forecasts compete with many things: habit, tradition, optimism, schedules, sunk costs, experience, pride, the view from the window and the behaviour of everyone nearby. If the parking area is full and other boats are launching, a person tends to borrow confidence from the crowd. If the morning light is decent and the air still feels manageable, it is easy to downgrade a warning in your own mind. If you have been through rough weather before, you may interpret this weather as belonging to that same category until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. This is not stupidity, it is social weather, if you like, the human side of atmospheric risk. That social side mattered enormously on Armistice Day. Hunters did not just see a mild morning, they saw other hunters heading out too. Crews did not just see roughening water, they saw work that still needed to be done and shipping patterns that had not yet collapsed. Families at home did not yet see catastrophe. They saw a holiday with bad weather moving in, the sort of thing a person complains about while expecting supper at the usual hour. A false calm is rarely silence. More often it is normal life continuing for just a little too long. Then the front moved through, and the pace of correction became brutal. During the late morning and early afternoon, a strong cold front crossed the region. Behind it, the weather turned blustery in a hurry. Rain changed to sleet, and then driving snow in many places, and temperatures plunged so sharply that by the next morning single digits were recorded in some areas. Heavy snow spread across the Dakotas, much of Minnesota and Iowa, and northwest Wisconsin, while gale-force winds hit the lakes and generated conditions severe enough to sink ships and trap people in open marsh and river environments. The same official sources note 30 to 50 mile-per-hour winds in many inland areas, 80 mile-per-hour gale velocities measured at Grand Rapids, Michigan, and even higher winds estimated over the lakes. Once the front had passed, whatever people had believed earlier in the morning was no longer relevant. The day had changed categories. That is the moment when forecast error becomes fatal. Not at breakfast, when the map is wrong in theory, but hours later, when somebody is too far out, too wet, too cold, too committed, or too slow to reverse course. The National Weather Service recounts that 12 duck hunters were trapped on the Mississippi River, between St. Paul and Prairie du Chien, by gale-force winds and threatening waves, forced onto small islands and eventually frozen to death. Elsewhere, hundreds of hunters lost boats, gear, and guns as 15-foot swells and winds of 70 to 80 miles per hour swept through channels and backwaters. On Lake Michigan, 59 lives were lost in shipwrecks and storm-related maritime disaster. These outcomes were not produced by weather alone. They were produced by weather arriving under a forecast and a morning mood that had not prepared people for this level of violence. There is an almost unbearable plainness to the chain of events. The forecast sounds tolerable. The morning feels decent. People go out, the birds fly, the ships continue, the wind picks up, the front comes through, the temperature falls, the water turns bad. The route back lengthens emotionally, then physically. A boat that was enough is no longer enough. A coat that was enough is no longer enough. A decision that seemed normal at 8 a.m. becomes irreversible by noon. This is how many weather disasters really happen. They are not built from one enormous mistake. They are built from a series of smaller, understandable assumptions that all stop working at once, and once that process begins, human beings often cling to the earliest useful explanation longer than they should. Perhaps it will pass. Perhaps it is only one squall line. Perhaps the forecast was broadly right, and this is the rough part before things settle. Perhaps shore is closer than it seems. Perhaps the wind will back off after the next bend, the next hour, the next run of bad visibility. Weather punishes perhaps with particular cruelty, because perhaps encourages delay without sounding foolish. It sounds reasonable. That is its danger. You can also see the misjudgment at the institutional level in what happened afterward. The uproar following the storm led to changes in how forecasting was handled. Support strengthened for keeping weather offices open 24 hours a day, and the Chicago office moved to round-the-clock operation. Regional forecasting responsibilities were also redistributed, with branch offices such as the Twin Cities upgraded so they could issue forecasts more quickly and accurately for their own areas. Systems usually do not change that way unless something has gone badly wrong in public view. Reform is often the formal name we give to guilt once it has acquired paperwork. Still, there is no comfort in blaming only the Weather Bureau. The story is larger than that. Forecasts matter, but they do not act alone. People misread weather partly because weather invites misreading. It changes unevenly across distance. It offers mild beginnings and bad endings. It lets one county look almost normal while another is already in trouble. It encourages familiarity until it suddenly does not. The Armistice Day Storm was meteorologically noteworthy because of its rapid intensification and widespread impacts, but it became historically unforgettable because those atmospheric facts met ordinary human behaviour in all the worst ways. Hunters saw birds and mild air. Captains saw a workable route under early wind. Officials saw a storm, but not the full storm. Communities saw a holiday turning ugly, not a disaster in progress. Every level of perception lagged behind reality by just enough. That lag is what makes the story feel so modern, even now. We like to believe technology has ended this kind of thing, or at least reduced it to freak exceptions. It has helped enormously, of course. Satellite data, radar, modern modelling, continuous staffing, instant alerts, all of these have changed weather safety for the better. But the emotional structure remains familiar. People still trust the first pleasant hour too much. They still measure official warnings against what they can currently see. They still let routine carry them farther into risk than they intended. The difference now is often one of degree, not of species. The old storm still feels legible because the old mistakes are not entirely old, and that is why this part of the story matters before we move farther onto the water. The deadliest decisions were not all dramatic. Many were quiet. A shirt chosen too lightly, a launch not postponed, a route not altered soon enough, a storm centre not watched closely enough before dawn, a forecast phrased too gently for the violence already on its way. No single one of those choices created the disaster by itself, but together they built a false sense of safety, broad enough to carry men into marshes, crews into open water, and an entire region into one of the most punishing weather days in its history. From there, the story narrows and hardens, because once the forecast is behind you and the front is through, all that remains is the water, the cold, the wind, and the men who now have to live inside the consequences of a day that looked ordinary for just a little too long. By the time the weather had stopped behaving like a tolerable holiday nuisance and started acting like a threat, the people in the worst position were not necessarily the ones farthest from land in any simple geographic sense. They were the ones most exposed, most committed to being outside, and least able to get dry once the day turned on them. That is why the hunters matter so much in this story. The Armistice Day Storm was not only a shipping disaster, and not only a regional blizzard. It was also a hunting day catastrophe. Across the upper Midwest, hundreds of duck hunters had gone out into wetlands, marshes, river bottoms, sloughs, and backwaters after a mild morning drew them in. National Weather Service accounts note that the day began with blue skies and temperatures in the 40s and 50s. Mild enough that some hunters headed to the marshes in short-sleeved shirts. when the cold front came through later that day, rain turned to sleet and then driving snow. Temperatures plunged, and the same men who had started the morning under a friendly sky found themselves in wind, water, and exposure severe enough to kill many of them. There is something especially cruel about the way hunting works into a storm like this, because hunting already asks a person to spend long hours in conditions that are not particularly comfortable. A duck hunter in November expects cold water, wet boots, numb fingers, some wind, and a fair amount of waiting. He does not expect the day to become impossible simply because it has become unpleasant. Hardship is already part of the activity. That means the first stage of a storm can disguise itself as ordinary discomfort. A man feels cold and thinks, well, yes, that is what this season is. His coat is damp and he thinks, also normal. The boat rocks harder than it did earlier and he thinks this is getting rough. The danger is that all of those judgments can remain technically reasonable right up until they are no longer enough to protect him. The storm did not strike people who were unaccustomed to weather. It struck people accustomed to the wrong amount of weather. Another detail makes the hunter's story even more unsettling. According to the National Weather Service account from Davenport, many hunters later said they had never seen so many birds. Masses of ducks arrived flying low, moving ahead of the storm. The birds understood the change long before many of the men below did. The flocks, which should have been a clue, also worked as a temptation. If you have gone out specifically for ducks, and suddenly the sky seems full of ducks, your attention narrows in exactly the wrong direction. The day appears to be paying off. The outing looks justified. The trip that might have seemed questionable in another hour now feels brilliant. That is one of the meanest little traps in this whole event. The sign of danger and the promise of success were, for a while, the same thing. The birds were not arriving to entertain the hunters. They were trying to get out of the weather. The men, understandably, saw opportunity first. That pattern is so human that it almost hurts to think about. People do not usually get themselves into trouble because they lack information entirely. More often, they have one piece of information directly in front of them and give it too much authority. On that day, the immediate fact for many hunters was simple. The birds were moving, the morning had started mild, and plenty of other men were out there too. Group confidence is powerful if the marsh is full of other boats and blinds, if everyone has launched, if nobody nearby is behaving as though the world is ending. Then the mind borrows calm from the crowd. That borrowed calm can last well past its expiration date. It helps explain why so many stayed out long enough to be overtaken. They were not isolated eccentrics making bizarre choices. They were part of a social routine, reinforced by the holiday, by the weather at dawn, and by the visible behaviour of everybody else. Normal life was still running, and that made it harder to feel that the day had already become abnormal. The physical setting made the danger worse in a very practical way. Much of the hunting took place in marshes and backwaters along the Mississippi. Places that can look open and manageable in fair weather but become confusing and punishing once strong wind and freezing conditions move in. These are not neat little ponds with a warm cafe half a mile away. They are broad water landscapes cut with channels, islands, reeds, mud flats, and low-lying cover that can become treacherous when visibility falls and the water rises under wind. Once the front hit, the weather changed fast enough that the route back stopped being a routine return and became a contest against time, cold, and wave action. The National Weather Service reports that hundreds of hunters lost boats, gear, and guns as 15-foot swells and 70 to 80 mile-per-hour winds swept down channels and marshy backwaters. That is a startling sentence because those are marine-sounding numbers attached to places many people imagine as sheltered inland hunting grounds. But that is exactly what the storm did. It stripped away the difference between marsh and open water and turned all of it into a hostile moving surface. Small boats suffer first in weather like that. They do not need to sink dramatically to become lethal. They only need to take on water, become unstable, lose power, or put a man into freezing water for a minute too long. Once a hunter gets wet in conditions like those, The problem changes category. One of the personal accounts preserved by the National Weather Service includes a survivor recalling that anyone who fell in the water or got wet somehow was done, and that what saved his group was keeping their clothing dry. That is an almost brutally useful sentence. It is not grand or literary. It is practical. Dry clothes versus wet clothes. That was the line between one kind of danger and another. People often imagine survival in storms as a matter of courage or willpower. Those things matter, but late autumn exposure is sometimes much simpler and harsher than that. Dry buys time, wet destroys it. Once clothes are soaked by spray, sleet, or immersion, the body begins losing heat in a way determination alone cannot negotiate with for very long. And wet was hard to avoid. Wind was driving water where water did not belong. Rain was changing to sleet and snow. Boats were pitching and slamming. Men were climbing in and out, leaning over, pulling gear, handling dogs, adjusting motors, or trying to free themselves from marshy edges and rough channels. Everything a hunter needed to do became slower, clumsier, and colder all at once. A task that might take 1 minute in fair weather might take 3 or 5 under these conditions, and every extra minute happened in wind strong enough to strip heat, confidence, and coordination from the body. Gloves get soaked, hands lose strength, knots become difficult, engines become uncertain, oars feel small and insulting. A man trying to do 3 urgent things at once in sleet and whitecaps does not make elegant decisions. He makes whichever decision still seems physically possible, while the weather continues worsening. That is why so many accounts from the storm feel less like stories of one big mistake, and more like stories of the day steadily removing options. Some tried to return early and were simply overtaken in the process. Others waited a little too long because weather often gives the impression it may level off after the next burst. That hope can be deadly because it sounds so reasonable at the time. A hunter in a blind might think the squall will pass. A man in a boat might think he can still make the crossing if he leaves now. Another might decide he should wait for a slight easing before trying open water. Each choice carries risk. The weather on that day was severe enough that there was no universally safe timing once the front and wind had fully arrived. The National Weather Service account from La Crosse notes that 12 duck hunters were trapped on the Mississippi River between St. Paul and Prairie du Chien by gale-force winds and threatening waves. They sought shelter on small islands and eventually froze to death, with rescue work the next day hindered by ice that formed during the night. Those men made the logical move available to them when the water itself became too dangerous. The awful part is that logic was no longer enough. That image of small islands is one of the hardest in the entire storm. Shelter, in ordinary language, sounds reassuring. It suggests refuge, cover, a place where danger is reduced. But an island in a river or marsh during a rapidly intensifying November storm is often not shelter in the full sense. It is only a pause in one form of danger. It may get you out of immediate waves, but it does not get you warm. It does not dry your clothes. It does not summon rescue through wind and darkness. It does not stop temperatures from falling into the teens and single digits. It simply changes the problem from drowning to exposure. And exposure is a patient killer. It does not need drama. It only needs time, cold, and a body that can no longer keep itself warm enough to go on making good decisions. The men on those islands were not safe. They were merely no longer in the water, which is not the same thing at all. Elsewhere, some hunters survived but paid a brutal price. Search parties in the days after the storm found men frozen on islands and in icy water, while others who had been stranded survived but lost hands or feet to severe frostbite. That detail matters because survival stories can sound too tidy if they are not handled carefully. To survive that storm in the marshes was not necessarily to escape it cleanly. Some were saved only after a night of impossible cold, wave action, and fear. Rescue itself was dangerous and delayed. One personal account describes rescue men from Alma being out in the blizzard all night, using inadequately sized boats to reach stranded hunters in churning white-capped waves. The courage of those rescuers should not hide the fact that the conditions had already become nearly unmanageable. They were not launching into merely rough weather. They were going after men in a situation where the weather had already begun to turn the geography against everybody involved. It is tempting to imagine the hunter's world in simple terms, men in blinds waiting with decoys, and then suddenly a storm. But the reality was more crowded and more chaotic. There were dogs to manage, partners to find, boats to steady, firearms to protect, motors that might sputter, channels that became dangerous, visibility that collapsed, and the creeping realization that the weather was moving faster than the body could adapt to it. Hunting adds emotional weight too. People are attached to their routines and equipment. They delay leaving because the birds are finally moving, because the motor may still start, because they do not want to abandon a boat, because a partner is not yet back, because they know the area and think they can still beat the weather. Every one of those reasons makes sense right up until the moment they become traps. That is why these events are so painful to reconstruct. The men in them were not behaving irrationally. They were being overtaken by conditions that had broken free of the scale they expected. There is also the matter of pride, though pride in the outdoors is not always vanity. Often it is just experience with another name. A man who has hunted marsh country for years knows what bad weather looks like there. He has returned in rain, in sleet, in ugly wind, in low visibility. He has dealt with cold motors, bad footing, numb hands, and miserable crossings. That background can keep a person calm, which is useful. It can also make him stay a little longer because the early stage of the storm still resembles difficulties he has managed before. The Armistice Day Storm exploited exactly that kind of seasoned confidence. It let people think for a while that the day was merely turning hard. By the time it became clear that the day had become dangerous in a different category, the hunters were already scattered across water and marshland instead of standing safely ashore with the luxury of a new decision. The numbers themselves tell a broad story, but the close view is what stays with you. Somewhere, a man likely saw the first line of birds and thought he was in for an unusually good day. Somewhere else, another man may have looked at the same birds and felt uneasy without fully knowing why. Then came the stronger wind, then the colder air, then the rain, then sleet, then snow, then the way visibility folds inward when everything in front of you becomes white, grey, spray, and moving reeds. At that point the birds no longer mattered. The limit of the day had changed. It was no longer about harvest or sport or even getting the gear back. It was about making it to any piece of ground that could keep a man upright and out of the water long enough for help or daylight or some merciful break in conditions. In too many cases, no such break came soon enough, and this is one reason the hunters remain central to the memory of the storm. Freighter losses are dramatic and easy to summarize. Big ships, big waves, sinking hulls, long casualty lists. But the hunters make the disaster feel intimate. They were not on commercial routes. They were not working huge decks or managing cargo. Many were in smaller boats and shallow country, close enough to land on a map that later readers might assume they should have had an easy time getting in. Yet close to land is not the same as safe when the water is rough. The channels are confused, the shorelines are low, and the weather is severe enough to freeze people where they stand. The hunters reveal something plain and awful about the storm. It was not only powerful over the open lakes, it was powerful enough to make even inland marsh country deadly. By the following day, the rescue and recovery effort itself showed just how complete the transformation had been. Ice had formed overnight badly enough to hinder rescue. Men still stranded in river bottoms and marshes had to be spotted and reached under conditions that remained harsh. Search parties recovered the dead in the days that followed. Survivors remembered the cold, the wind, the white-capped water, and the simple, brutal fact that anyone who got wet was in terrible danger. The storm had entered the hunting grounds as weather and left them as a field of losses, damaged boats, frostbite, drowned men, and names that local communities would keep long after the holiday itself resumed its ordinary meaning on the calendar. So when we stay with the hunters on the water, the event stops looking like a broad weather statistic and starts looking like what it really was in lived terms. Men led out by a mild morning, held in place by birds and routine, then cut off by a front that arrived harder and faster than the forecast had prepared them for. Some tried to outrun it and could not. Some tried to wait it out and froze. Some were rescued by men taking immense risks in boats too small for the conditions. Some survived because they kept dry, or found slightly better shelter, or happened to leave just early enough. And once you have followed them that far, you can feel the story tightening even more, because the same storm that trapped hunters in marshes was also building into something larger over the lakes themselves, where the wind shift, the waves, and the cargo ships were about to create an even wider field of disaster. There comes a point in a storm story when all the early misunderstandings are finished, even if no one says so aloud. The forecast no longer matters in the same way, because the weather has already stepped beyond it. The mild morning no longer matters, because whatever promise it made has been withdrawn. The habits of the day, the holiday routines, the idea that there is still time to decide later, all of that begins to break apart together. When the Armistice Day Storm finally broke over the people already out in it, the change was not subtle. A strong cold front moved through during the late morning and early afternoon, and behind it the weather changed with real force. Rain turned to sleet, and then to driving snow in many places. Winds climbed into gale strength and beyond, and temperatures that had begun the day in the 40s and 50s plunged toward the single digits by the following morning. That is the moment when a hard day becomes a dangerous one. Before the front, discomfort still belongs to ordinary life. A person can complain about it, adjust to it, button a coat, keep moving. After the front, the weather begins issuing commands. It alters how fast you can travel, what you can see, how dry you can stay, and how long your body can keep solving problems without heat. That is what made this storm so severe. It did not simply arrive. It arrived after people were already spread across marshes, roads, fields, and open water, and it did not give them the courtesy of a long negotiation. The National Weather Service described severe weather erupting across much of the Midwest as the day went on, with a heavy rain in parts of the Mississippi Valley, heavy snow beginning across Minnesota and western Iowa, and gale velocities measured at 80 miles per hour at Grand Rapids, Michigan, with even higher winds estimated over the lakes. Over the Great Lakes, that change would have felt immediate and physical in a way that people on land only partly experienced. A storm over open water does not hide its intentions for long. The lake surface translates wind into violence very efficiently. Earlier in the day, some captains had favoured the east shore of Lake Michigan because the wind was from the southeast and increasing. That was a sensible decision under the version of the day they believed they were in. But once the storm shifted and the southwest gales arrived, those same vessels were in a terrible position. The National Weather Service summary puts it plainly: the ships could neither run before the storm nor safely withstand the battering that came from heading into the gale and high waves. This is one of those moments in history where a few words explain an enormous amount of suffering. They could not run before it, and they could not face into it. That is not merely bad weather. That is entrapment on a moving surface. The lake had changed the meaning of every earlier choice. A route that seemed prudent in the morning became dangerous by afternoon. Distance changed. Safety changed. Even the idea of shore changed, because shore was no longer simply the place one meant to reach. It had become a thing weather might prevent. For the men on those ships, the storm was not only stronger than expected, it was organised in the wrong direction. It hit at the wrong time, after enough movement had already taken place to leave them exposed when the full force came on. And full force is not an exaggeration here. On Lake Michigan, the greatest losses of the storm came when the southwest gales did their work. 3 freighters sank off Pentwater near Ludington: the William B. Davock, the Anna C. Minch, and the Novadoc. The losses from those 3 alone were devastating. According to the National Weather Service, the Davock lost 33 men, the Annecy Minch 24 and the Novadoc 2. Other drownings followed when the fishing tugs Indian and Richard H. and the motor cruiser Nancy Jane were lost on the southern end of Lake Michigan. In all, the storm claimed 154 lives across the region, including 59 on Lake Michigan. It is worth slowing down there for a moment, because numbers can become too neat if they're read too quickly. 59 lives on Lake Michigan means deckhands, officers, engineers, men with routines and habits and families and very ordinary thoughts earlier that day. Some were almost certainly still dealing with the storm first as work, not yet as disaster. That is one of the grim features of maritime catastrophe. The day may already be in the process of becoming historic, and the people inside it are still checking equipment, watching the water, calculating speed, thinking in terms of seamanship. But once the wind and waves begin exceeding what a vessel can manage, professionalism stops being protection in the larger sense. It remains valuable, certainly. It may keep a ship afloat a little longer, may bring another one battered into port, may save some. Yet even excellent judgment on a ship has limits when the lake decides to turn all of its weight in one direction. And there was weight in it. One account from the Marine Summary describes the freighter Wyandot, carrying 2,700 tons of coal and bound for Alpena, making so little headway at the height of the storm that an 11-mile-an-hour vessel could manage only 2 to 3 miles an hour in some places, while water broke over her decks in solid sheets, and even poured into the smokestack at times. That detail gives the storm a physical shape that is hard to ignore. Water was not simply rough. It was coming aboard as force, crossing surfaces meant to resist ordinary heavy weather and still making a mockery of them. On land and in the marshes, the storm's breaking point looked different, but it was no less severe. Hunters who had begun the day under blue skies and mild air were now dealing with rain that changed to sleet and heavy snow, visibility collapsing, temperatures dropping, and water turning into white-capped danger. The National Weather Service account from Davenport says that across the Midwest, hundreds of duck hunters, not dressed for the cold, were overtaken after winds came suddenly and masses of ducks arrived flying low. Hunters focused on the birds failed to see how quickly the weather was changing. By the time rain, sleet and heavy snow reduced visibility to zero, many had lost their chance to return safely to shore. That phrase matters. They lost their chance to return safely. The change in weather was not just dramatic, it was strategically disastrous. There had been a window in which retreat remained difficult but possible. Then there was a point at which the same return became a trap. Hundreds of hunters lost boats, gear and guns as 15-foot swells and winds of 70 to 80 miles per hour swept down channels and marshy backwaters. Some drowned. Others froze after temperatures that had been near 60 degrees dropped first to freezing and then towards single digits. The same day that had invited them out now refused to let them back in. That is often what the storm broke really means in lived experience. Not merely that the precipitation intensified or the barometer fell, but that ordinary movement stopped working. A road that was passable becomes blocked, a boat that was useful becomes fragile, a shoreline that was visible disappears behind spray and snow. A man who expected to be cold becomes wet, and once he is wet, he is no longer arguing only with weather, but with time. Dry clothing can buy a life a few more hours. Wet clothing can turn a bad position into a fatal one. Survivors later remembered that anyone who fell in or got wet was in terrible danger, and that keeping clothing dry was one of the few things that made survival possible. The speed of the temperature drop made the whole event even harder to survive. One of the Weather Service summaries notes that by morning, temperatures had fallen to around 2 degrees above zero in some places, after a drop of about 70 degrees since Monday noon. That kind of collapse is not just unpleasant, it changes every decision a body can make. Hands stop working properly. Thought slows, exposed skin becomes a problem quickly. Tasks that would be merely irritating in mild cold begin failing altogether. Knots, motors, doors, lines, oars, matches, all the little things that people rely on to get themselves out of trouble start becoming stubborn at the exact moment they need them most. Weather like this also has a way of becoming larger than the initial place where it strikes. It was not only the hunters in the marshes and not only the ships on the lakes. Severe weather erupted across much of the Midwest. A tornado was reported west of Davenport, Iowa. Heavy snow buried parts of Minnesota and western Iowa. Drifts rose to extraordinary heights in some areas, trapping motorists and stranding trains. Roads and highways closed for days in places. Power and telephone lines were damaged. Barns, homes and outbuildings were hit. The storm did not focus its anger neatly. It spread it across systems people relied on to move, communicate, work and rescue one another. That broad regional damage is part of what makes the Armistice Day Storm so difficult to hold in one picture. It was several kinds of disaster at the same time. If you were a hunter, it was wind and water, and the terrible problem of getting out alive. If you were on a freighter, it was waves and wind shift, and the possibility that the ship itself might not remain a ship for much longer in any useful sense. If you were on shore, it was roads closing, temperatures falling, power lines down, and the growing realization that people already out in it might not be reachable until much later. A storm that spreads itself across jobs and landscapes like that does not merely do damage. It rearranges whole regions for a day or two into places of waiting, searching and counting. You can almost feel the timing of it in the way the reports read. Morning still belongs to human plans, afternoon belongs to the front, evening belongs to survival. By then the sky is no longer giving mixed signals, it has become one clear fact. The wind is steady in the wrong way. The snow and sleet are no longer decoration on top of a storm but part of the machinery making the storm harder to escape. The lakes are no longer difficult, they are punishing. The marshes are no longer familiar hunting ground, they are confused cold water cut by white caps. And for people at home, the delay itself begins to speak. When men do not come in at the expected hour, when roads are impassable, when the weather remains too severe for easy searching, dread fills in the space where certainty should be. There are details from the official accounts that show just how complete the storm's force had become. Sustained southwest gales pushed Lake Michigan's water levels dramatically, dropping the level at Chicago by 4.8 feet while causing a rise of 4 to 4.5 feet at Beaver Island. The Fox River dropped about 5 feet because of the winds, enough to force paper mills and a power plant at Green Bay to suspend operations. In Saginaw Bay, water reportedly receded a mile in places, lowering the Saginaw River and exposing intake pipes at Bay City. Those are not just curiosities. They tell you that the wind was reshaping water bodies on a large scale. The storm was not simply making waves, it was moving entire systems around under sustained force. And still, even at the height of this, not every story ended the same way. Some ships were badly battered but made port. Some vessels were driven ashore or onto reefs instead of going down outright. Some hunters found islands or patches of shelter and lived long enough for rescue, though many paid for survival with severe frostbite. Some rescue crews went out in conditions that sound nearly impossible now, using boats too small for what they faced, working through churning white-capped waves and blizzard conditions to pull stranded men back. That is another reason the storm feels so intense. It did not sort people into simple categories of saved and lost. It left many suspended in between for hours, sometimes all night, waiting to see whether the weather would take one more thing from them before morning. The men who endured the worst of that first full break in the storm would have experienced something very plain and very hard. The world had become reduced to essentials: heat, balance, direction, dryness, shelter, light. You can read all the meteorology you like, and it remains useful, but at the centre of the event there is always a body in bad weather trying to solve those same few problems. Where can I stand? How can I stay dry? Which way is safety? How long until dark? Can this boat still carry me? Can this ship still answer the sea? Can anyone get to us? When the storm finally broke, those questions became more important than the holiday, the forecast, the birds, the cargo, and even, for a while, the proper names of places. The weather had stripped the day down to survival work. There is also something sobering in the way sound must have changed. Heavy weather has its own vocabulary. Earlier, there would have been engines, conversation, dogs, rigging, marsh sounds, the regular noises of people doing what they came to do. Once the storm fully asserted itself, much of that would have been buried under the constant rush and impact of wind, spray, sleet, and wave action. Commands get shorter in weather like that. Speech becomes practical and sparse. Hold this, get down, start it, tie that, move now. The storm does not merely alter the landscape, it alters language. It makes people speak in the shortest available route between fear and function. And then, as the day moved toward night, the worst fact of all began to settle in. This was not going to be a brief outburst. The National Weather Service notes that rescue efforts the next day were hindered by ice that formed overnight. That tells you something immediately about the length and severity of the cold. It was not just a violent afternoon followed by an easier evening. It was a storm that crossed over into a freezing night hard enough to lock surfaces, trap survivors, delay rescue, and turn any remaining wetness into another kind of enemy. By morning, in some river bottom areas, dozens of freezing men still awaited rescue. So when we say the storm finally broke, what we really mean is that all the separate pieces at last came together. The bad forecast, the mild start, the holiday crowds, the birds, the wind shift, the plunging temperatures, the open water, the shallow backwaters, the failing visibility, the ordinary human habit of staying just a little too long, all of it met in the same hours. After that, the story no longer belongs to warning or misjudgment. It belongs to endurance, to boats hanging on, to men stranded on islands, to freighters battered broadside, to rescuers trying to launch when launching itself is dangerous, to families waiting through a night that has become too cold and too long. And that is where the next part naturally carries us, because once the front had gone through and the weather had shown its full hand, what remained was the water in motion, the ice forming around the edges of hope, and the long night in which survival became a matter of staying alive 1 hour at a time. Night is where storms stop feeling like weather and start feeling like a test of time. In daylight, even a bad storm allows a person a few illusions. You can still tell yourself that shore is visible. You can still think you have options. You can still make one more attempt, one more run, one more correction, and pretend that movement itself means control. Once darkness settles in over cold water, over marshes, over wrecked plans and failing routes, those illusions begin to disappear. The Armistice Day Storm was already deadly by late afternoon, but the long night that followed is where the event became something even harder to bear, because by then many of the people caught in it were no longer trying to avoid danger. They were trying to remain alive long enough for morning to matter. For the hunters stranded along the Mississippi backwaters, that meant a very plain set of problems. They needed dry clothing if they could keep it. They needed some kind of windbreak, even a poor one. They needed fire if fire was possible. They needed to stay out of the water. They needed to stay awake, or at least not sink into the kind of stillness that cold invites and then punishes. The National Weather Service's historical summary says 12 duck hunters trapped between St. Paul and Prairie du Chien sought shelter on small islands and eventually froze to death, with rescue work the next day hindered by ice that formed during the preceding night. That fact by itself explains how terrible the night became. Rescue was not merely delayed by darkness, it was delayed by cold severe enough to begin changing the surface of the world before dawn. And those 12 were not the whole story. In the Winona River bottoms, by morning the temperature was 2 degrees above zero, the blizzard was still raging, and about 50 freezing men still awaited rescue after a roughly 70-degree temperature drop since Monday noon. 3 rescue men from Alma were out in the blizzard all night, using undersized boats in white-capped waves, and the last stranded hunters in the Alma area were not pulled out until about 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. The same National Weather Service personal account page says 20 men died between Red Wing and Prairie du Chien. That is the scale of the night we're dealing with here. Not 1 or 2 isolated tragedies, but a wide stretch of river country turning into a field of exposure, improvised fires, delayed rescues, and men trying to outlast hours that had become colder than anyone had prepared for. There is something especially hard about river and marsh country, after dark in a storm, because it offers the shape of shelter without always providing the substance of it. An island sounds safe until you remember that an island in November, under wind and sleet and plunging temperatures, may only protect you from one immediate form of death while leaving you exposed to another. A clump of trees breaks some wind, perhaps, but it does not warm wet clothes. A boat pulled onto reeds may keep you out of open waves, but it does not become a heated room just because you want it to. During a summer storm, rough shelter can buy comfort. During a late autumn blizzard, rough shelter only buys an argument with time. That is why the survivor accounts from the Armistice Day Storm are so direct. They are not interested in sounding grand. They are interested in what worked and what failed. Oscar Girth, one of the men who lived through it, later said that anyone who went out that day and fell into the water or got wet was done, and that what saved his group was keeping their clothing dry. He also remembered that it froze so hard during the night that the next morning they were able to walk over little ponds in single file. There is no decoration in that memory, just simple arithmetic. Dry clothes gave people a chance. Wet clothes took the chance away. Ice arrived before rescue could reach everyone. The night closed over them, and the cold began sorting outcomes with a kind of mechanical indifference, and even dry clothes were not a complete answer. Wind kept working, bodies kept cooling, hands stiffened, feet went numb. Men had to decide whether to stay in one place and preserve what little shelter they had, or move and risk losing their way in blowing snow and darkness. One survivor account on the same weather service page describes a hunter stumbling back to his car around 9:15 p.m, numb all over, with ice having welded his sock to the accelerator. He got home alive, but only barely, and only after the car's radiator had frozen. Those kinds of details are useful because they pull the story back into ordinary things. Socks, pedals, a car with no heater, a father listening to the radio and realizing the day had gone wrong. Survival in storms is often made of ordinary objects behaving badly under extraordinary conditions. Elsewhere in the marshes and sloughs, people survived because they managed to do the rough practical things that cold weather demands. On the same weather service account page, some of the lucky hunters are described as stranded in groups large enough to build substantial fires, while Girth and others survived by maintaining dry clothing and staying close to what little heat and shelter they could make. Another personal account recalls a man being found nearly gone after sitting down and falling asleep in the cold, then being helped back by another hunter who put a parka around him during a long walk home. That is the kind of thing a storm night becomes, a world in which a coat, a shared fire, a partner who notices, or the bad luck of sitting down too early may make all the difference. Fire, of course, was one of the few tools strong enough to push back against a night like that. But fire has its own logic. You need fuel. You need a place where the wind cannot strip it away instantly. You need enough people, or enough persistence to keep it going. The Weather Service's personal account page includes the story of Oscar Girth surviving after chopping up handmade cedar decoys and burning them to stay alive. That is such a harsh little image because it reveals how quickly the normal priorities of the day collapsed. The decoys had been brought out as part of the hunt. By night, they were no longer tools of the hunt at all, they were simply wood. If they could burn, they mattered. If they could not, they did not. The storm had reduced the world to heat, dryness, and the next hour. There is also the matter of sound during a night like that. By evening, the normal sounds of the day would have thinned out. No more useful talk about birds or roots or what time people expected to be home. No more easy working noises. Wind takes over the soundtrack of a storm night. It presses itself into everything. It keeps people from hearing one another clearly. It makes distance feel larger. It turns the world beyond a fire's edge into uncertainty. Some men would have been close enough to hear shots or calls and still not know whether they could safely move toward them. Some would have known others were stranded somewhere in the dark and still understood that trying to reach them might only add one more body to the night's accounting. That's one of the ugliest features of severe exposure events. They force people into a kind of practical helplessness. Compassion stays, capability goes. The rescuers face that same cruelty. Weather Service accounts describe rescue men from Alma spending the whole night in the blizzard, pushing inadequately sized boats into churning white-capped waves to reach stranded hunters. Another account says plainly that everyone knew there were men trapped out there, and everyone knew some would not make it through the night. That is a sentence that stays with you because it captures the emotional shape of the hours after dark. The need was obvious, the courage was there. What was missing was not willingness, it was margin. The storm had removed margin from everyone, including the people trying to help. And while that was happening in the marshes and on the river, the Night on Lake Michigan was writing a larger but closely related version of the same story. The marine summary from the National Weather Service describes vessels that were badly battered but survived, and it quotes the master of the Wyandotte reporting that waves broke over the decks in solid sheets and that water poured into the smokestack at times. A vessel capable of 11 miles an hour could make only 2 to 3 in some stretches. That is not just rough going. That is a ship enduring an environment strong enough to strip speed, control and confidence away hour by hour. When darkness arrives over water in those conditions, survival becomes a matter of endurance and structure. The men aboard are no longer asking whether the weather will improve tonight. They are asking whether the ship will keep answering the lake long enough to deliver them somewhere other than the bottom. The lakes themselves were being physically rearranged by the gale. The same marine summary notes a 4.8-foot drop in Lake Michigan's level at Chicago and a 4 to 4.5-foot rise at Beaver Island, while on Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay water receded dramatically in some places, exposing intake pipes and forcing shutdowns. Those figures are useful because they remind us that this was not only a matter of dangerous waves. Sustained wind was pushing water around on a basin-wide scale. So when crews spent the night trying to hold course, maintain headway, or simply avoid foundering, they were not working against ordinary weather amplified a little. They were working inside a system that had become forceful enough to reshape levels, currents, shore impacts, and the whole practical meaning of navigation. Night makes such conditions worse because darkness steals information. A captain can feel the vessel's response and see the sea state in daylight. At night, the lake becomes a thing known by impact, motion and sound more than by sight. A breaking sea is not merely seen then. It is heard, felt through the hull, taken aboard over the deck, and measured in the angle at which the ship answers back. The men on the ships that survived likely spent those hours in a state somewhere between trained concentration and exhausted disbelief, because there is only so much a body can do with repeated violent motion, cold, uncertainty, and the knowledge that other ships are out there somewhere in the same darkness and may not be faring as well. That link between the hunters and the mariners is what makes the long night of the Armistice Day Storm so striking. On the surface, their situations were different. One group was in marshes and river backwaters, the other on big freighters and open lake routes. But by dark, the problem had become much the same. All of them were fighting exposure, limited options, and the slow passage of hours under conditions that could no longer be mastered, only survived. It is one thing to get through a short burst of violent weather. It is another to discover as evening settles that the storm has no interest in ending before the cold deepens and rescue becomes harder. By dawn on November 12th, the first shape of the night's damage was becoming visible. Max Conrad, flying a Piper Cub into a 50-mile-per-hour headwind, spent the day helping guide rescuers to stranded hunters and dropping supplies such as food, whiskey and cigarettes. Survivors later remembered his low passes as a sign of hope. That image matters because it tells you what the night had done. Morning did not arrive with immediate relief, it arrived with searching. Men still had to be located. Some were huddled near tipped-over boats, some were on islands, some had held out by fires, some had not made it. The airplane circling overhead was not witnessing a completed event. It was entering a landscape still in the middle of rescue, and for many communities, dawn brought not certainty but counting. Search parties began looking in earnest. Families waited for names. Towns along the river and the lake started to understand that the storm had not merely been severe. It had been one of those days that divide local memory into before and after. The official weather summary says rescue work the next day was hindered by ice, and the personal accounts describe men still awaiting help well into Tuesday morning. That means the night did not end cleanly with sunrise. It spilled over. Ice and cold carried it forward. Morning was only the next stage of the same ordeal. There is a temptation, when telling storm stories, to make survival sound noble in a polished way. But the survivors' own memories suggest something less polished and more convincing. They remember numb feet, stiff hands, black water, white caps, bad boats, improvised fires, frozen clothing, and the simple knowledge that anyone who got wet was in grave danger. They remember that rescue crews were brave but badly matched to the conditions. They remember that some men were lost not because no one cared, but because no one could reach them in time. They remember the next morning's ice and how the world had changed shape overnight. Those are not theatrical memories, they are practical ones, which is one reason they feel so trustworthy. So the long night of survival was not one clean story. It was many small battles against the same cold, a hunter keeping his gloves as dry as possible, another burning what he had brought to imitate life and turning it instead into life's last useful fuel. A rescuer pushing a small boat into water that had no business receiving one. A shipmaster holding a freighter against waves that broke in solid sheets. Men on islands waiting to hear something other than wind. Families on shore listening for engines or footsteps that did not come when expected. By the time daylight strengthened, the storm had already made most of its decisions. Morning would reveal them, rescue around them, and begin the harder work of naming the lost, which is where this story now naturally moves into the first light, the first surveys, and the long count that followed. By the time dawn finally arrived, the storm itself had not really ended so much as loosened its grip just enough for people to begin looking at what it had done. That is an important difference. There is a version of morning after disaster that people like to imagine, one where the clouds part a little, the light falls cleanly across the landscape and everything becomes sad but understandable. The dawn after the Armistice Day Storm was not that kind of dawn. In many places the cold was still intense, the wind was still working, the ice from the night had already begun interfering with movement, and rescue crews were not stepping into a finished scene. They were stepping into a region that was still in trouble, with stranded men still out there, damaged vessels still waiting, and families still without answers. The National Weather Service summary notes that the temperature plunged to the single digits by the next morning, rescue work on the Mississippi was hindered by ice that formed overnight, and the storm's total death toll ultimately reached 154 across the region. Dawn, in other words, did not bring peace, it brought visibility. And visibility, after a night like that, can be its own kind of burden. Once there is enough light to see, people begin noticing who is missing, which boats have not returned, which islands still hold figures hunched close to the ground, which shorelines have wreckage against them, and which expected arrivals are no longer merely delayed. In the river bottoms and marshes, men who had survived the night still needed to be found and reached. On the lakes, the first clearer reports of sinkings, groundings, and battered survivors had to be gathered into something like a count. The weather was still severe enough that help itself moved slowly, so the morning became a long exercise in locating, reaching, lifting, carrying, naming, and revising numbers that no one wanted to revise upward, even though many already knew they would. Along the Mississippi, some of the rescue work was as improvised and stubborn as the survival had been. The National Weather Service's personal accounts page says that by morning, the temperature in the Winona River bottoms was about 2 degrees above zero, around 50 freezing men still awaited rescue, and 3 rescue men from Alma had already been out in the blizzard all night, using inadequately sized boats in churning white-capped waves. The last stranded hunters in the Alma area were not rescued until about 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. That is such a telling detail because it refuses any easy sense of closure. Morning did not simply reveal survivors and send them home. It found men still out there after a whole night in those conditions, still dependent on crews who had to keep launching into water and wind that had already proved lethal. And then there is Max Conrad, one of those figures who enters a disaster story at exactly the point when people need a sign that the world has not abandoned them entirely. The same Weather Service account says that at dawn on November 12th, he took his Piper Cub into a 50-mile-per-hour headwind and spent the day guiding rescue parties to stranded hunters, dropping food, whiskey and cigarettes to some of them. Survivors remembered seeing him overhead, flying low enough to spot men under or near overturned boats. That image has remained with the story for a reason. It is not only dramatic, it also captures the strange mixture of modern improvisation and old-fashioned nerve that so often appears after weather disasters. A small airplane in a brutal wind, a pilot working low over flooded, frozen, storm-damaged ground, trying to turn visibility into hope. By then the storm had already taken what it meant to take during the night. Morning's work was the slower, harder business of seeing who had been left behind and getting to them before the cold finished what the water had started. Some men were lucky in the plainest possible ways. They had found enough shelter. They had stayed dry enough. They had enough company to keep a fire going. They were close enough to be seen from the air or reach from shore. The personal accounts describe one group of 17 hunters stranded on an island in Strait Slough, who survived the night by building and feeding a large fire, taking turns fetching wood, and waiting until morning made shore reachable again. That kind of survival story matters because it reminds you how narrow the margin could be. A few more people, a little less wood, a little more exposure, a slightly worse location, and the count might have been different. In storms like this, the line between being listed as rescued and being counted among the lost is often not a matter of character. It is a matter of conditions, timing, and small practical advantages that only become visible after dawn. Others were found too late, and this is where the morning begins to harden emotionally. The official summary from La Crosse says that 12 duck hunters trapped on the Mississippi between St. Paul and Prairie du Chien had sought shelter on small islands and eventually froze to death. The personal accounts page adds that 20 men died between Red Wing, Minnesota and Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, with the heaviest losses around Winona. Those are not quite the same framing of the same tragedy, and that difference is worth respecting rather than smoothing over. One count points to the specific island tragedy on the river. The other reflects the broader stretch of hunting losses in the region. Both are true in context, and together they show how the count of the lost was not one neat number discovered all at once at sunrise. It had layers, it had places, it had local clusters of grief that only gradually assembled into the wider catastrophe the region would later remember. That is often how counting works after a storm. First there are names the local people already fear, then there are bodies recovered, then there are those still missing. Then the newspapers begin to collect the facts while still getting some of them wrong or incomplete. Then officials settle on broader totals, and even those can differ slightly depending on which subset of the event they emphasise. The Weather Service's main storm summary gives 154 deaths overall, including 49 in Minnesota and 59 from Lake Michigan shipwrecks. Another Weather Service page about the blizzard's social impact says 3 large ships sank near Pentwater, and 58 lives were lost there, while the Marine page breaks down the ship and small boat losses in a way that supports the 59 Lake Michigan total used elsewhere. That small discrepancy is not unusual in historic disaster records, especially when different pages are summarising related but not identical categories. What does remain consistent is the scale. The storm killed well over 100 people, devastated river hunters, and turned Lake Michigan into the site of one of the deadliest freshwater maritime disasters in the region's history. The lake count came into focus through a different kind of dawn, slower and more maritime. Some ships were already known lost, others had vanished into the night and had to be confirmed by wreckage, by the absence of radio contact, by survivors from related vessels, or by the terrible arithmetic of who had not made port. The marine summary from the National Weather Service says the greatest losses were on Lake Michigan, where the full force of the southwest gales sank the freighters William B. Davok, Anna C. Minch, and Novadoc off Pentwater near Luddington. It gives the losses as 33 men on the Davok, 24 on the Anna C. Minch, and 2 on the Novadoc, and then adds 10 more drownings from the losses of the fishing tugs Indian and Richard H. and the motor cruiser Nancy Jane on the southern end of the lake. That is the kind of official list that sounds almost calm when read aloud, which is perhaps why it hits so hard. The names are tidy, the casualties are numbered, but each entry represents an entire small world of waiting, uncertainty, and then final confirmation. And even where ships did not sink outright, dawn did not necessarily mean immediate rescue. One Weather Service page notes that survivors on ships that ran aground waited for days on their damaged vessels until the wind subsided enough for rescue boats to be launched from shore. That is one of those details that quietly enlarges the disaster. It tells you that the first day's count of the lost existed beside another population, the not yet saved. These were men who had survived the main violence, but were still stuck on wrecked or grounded ships, while the lake remained too dangerous for easy approach. In other words, the storm's aftermath was not only a matter of counting the dead, it was also a matter of extending the rescue timetable far beyond dawn, because the weather and water were still controlling access to the living. Back inland, the rescue maps were becoming social maps as well. Communities along the river knew where people usually hunted. They knew which launches had gone out. They knew which sons, brothers, fathers and neighbours had planned to be in which sloufs, islands and backwaters. So the dawn rescue effort was not just an official operation, it was deeply local. Men from towns like Alma were already out there in boats. People on shore were watching the air, the river, the roads. The Weather Service's media archive shows that by November 12th and 13th, newspapers across Minnesota, Iowa and Wisconsin were already covering the storm heavily, including full papers from Winona and front pages from towns across the affected region. That is a useful clue to the morning atmosphere. This was not a disaster hidden in one marsh or one harbour. By the next day it had become a public event, one that communities were trying to understand in real time while still searching for their own missing people. Newspaper attention does something peculiar after a storm. It begins the transition from private fear to public history. The moment a local death is printed, it becomes part of a broader civic count. The same event that is, for one family, a missing man and a kitchen table full of dread becomes, on the front page, a weather tragedy with numbers and geography attached. That process can feel cold, but it is also how regions begin to remember. The Armistice Day Storm moved very quickly from lived ordeal to reported catastrophe. The newspapers gathered the fragments. The Weather Bureau examined what had gone wrong. Communities began telling and retelling the rescues, the survivals, the mistakes and the losses. Dawn was therefore not just the beginning of physical rescue, it was also the beginning of narrative rescue, the effort to assemble an event too large and scattered to hold in one glance. Still, while the public story was taking shape, the local one remained brutally specific. A son not back yet, a boat found and recognised, a body recovered from icy water, a name added to the list at the courthouse, the newspaper office, or the conversations gathering in town. The Personal Accounts Archive preserves the memory of Gerald Tarras surviving while seeing his father, a brother and a friend die. It preserves the memory of men being found near islands and tipped boats. It preserves the memory of rescue crews knowing during the night that some trapped men would not make it until morning. These are not broad statistics. They are the emotional grain of the count. Every disaster total is made of these small, terrible specifics. The number 154 sounds official. The human reality of it is a string of households discovering that a person expected at breakfast or supper is now part of history instead. The counting also widened beyond human loss. The main storm summary notes that thousands of cattle in Iowa were killed and more than 1 million turkeys died in Wisconsin, Minnesota and other states. Those details can seem secondary beside the human dead, yet they matter because they show what the dawn revealed at the regional scale. The storm had not only taken lives, it had damaged winter supplies, farm operations, transport, and local economies. Lake Michigan communities lost ships and crews. River towns lost hunters and rescuers' sleep. Rural areas lost livestock and poultry. Roads were blocked, drifts rose high, and entire counties had to shift from ordinary routines into emergency accounting. Dawn made all of that visible at once, and that visibility changed the meaning of the storm almost immediately. Before the rescue work, it was still a day of terrible weather. During the rescue, it became a disaster. During the count, it became one of those events a region uses to measure later events. The aftermath page from the National Weather Service says the storm remained culturally important for decades, recorded in newspaper clippings, photos, museum collections, cookbooks, journal articles, and family oral traditions. That sounds almost quiet when set against the violence of the storm itself, but it is actually the long echo of the count. Once the names were gathered, once the losses were distributed across river towns, farms, shipping communities, and families, the storm moved from weather into memory. It began doing what large disasters always do. It changed how later generations thought about forecasts, late autumn hunting, November shipping, and what bad weather could mean in that part of the country. There is something sober in the fact that official forecasting changed because of this storm. The same aftermath source says it strengthened support for keeping weather offices open 24 hours a day and helped redistribute forecasting responsibilities to regional centres for more timely and accurate predictions. That reform belongs to the story of the count as much as to the story of the storm itself. Numbers do not just close a tragedy. Sometimes they force institutions to admit that their earlier assumptions were not enough. A count of the lost can become a kind of argument the dead continue making after the weather has moved on. But in the immediate dawn after the Armistice Day Storm, none of that future reform would have provided much comfort. The people living through that morning were not yet thinking in terms of meteorological policy. They were thinking in terms of who had made it through the night, who was still out there, who had been pulled from the water, who was in the hospital, who had not come in from the lake, and whether the next vehicle, boat or airplane sighting would bring relief or confirmation of the worst. Rescue and counting happened side by side. That is what made the morning so heavy. Every survivor found made hope briefly stronger. Every body found made hope narrower. Every revised total turned the storm from an emergency into an irreversible fact. And this is where the story naturally deepens into its final historical shape. Because once the rescue work begins and the count of the lost starts settling into official memory, another question rises behind it almost at once. Not only what happened, but why this storm, out of so many late autumn storms on the lakes, became the deadliest. Why this one outran the forecast, trapped the hunters, broke the ships, and left behind a toll large enough to change weather practice and regional memory. Dawn gave people the first hard look at the damage. The next step is to understand why this particular storm reached so far and hit so many different lives at once, which is where the story now turns, from the count itself to the deeper reasons the Armistice Day Storm became the deadliest of them all. What made the Armistice Day Storm the deadliest was not a single dramatic feature, but the way several dangerous features arrived at the same time and then reinforced one another. If this had only been a bad Great Lakes gale, it would have been serious. If it had only been a severe upper Midwest blizzard, it would still have been serious. If it had only been a forecasting failure, or only a holiday with too many people outdoors, or only a rapid temperature crash after a mild morning, each of those on its own would have created trouble. What made this storm so destructive was that all of those things happened together. The National Weather Service's summaries agree on the broad result. The storm killed 154 people across the region, including 59 on Lake Michigan, and it did so across several different landscapes at once, from open water to marshes to highways to farm country. That combination is the first reason it became the deadliest. It was not a narrow disaster in one place. It was a wide regional event that struck different groups in different ways, all under the same rapidly intensifying system. The second reason was timing, and timing in weather disasters is often far more important than people realise. The storm hit on Armistice Day, a holiday, which meant more people were outside than might otherwise have been. Hunters had the day free, travel patterns were altered. People who might have stayed near home on a regular workday instead made plans, launched boats, drove roads, and spread themselves across rivers, marshes and the lakes. The Weather Service account from Davenport states plainly that hundreds of duck hunters were out across the Midwest when the storm overtook them, and that many were not dressed for the cold because of how mild the day had begun. A storm does not need to become stronger to kill more people if more people have placed themselves in exposed positions before it arrives. That is one of the blunt truths of this event. The holiday did not create the storm, but it increased the number of people available to be caught by it. In disaster terms, exposure began before the first sleet hit anyone in the face. The mild beginning of the day was the third reason, and it may have been one of the most deceptive. The National Weather Service summary says the morning began with blue skies and temperatures in the 40s and 50s across parts of the region. That sounds manageable by November standards. More than manageable, really. It sounds like a day a person can work with. In practical terms, a mild start changes clothing, equipment, urgency, and mood. It encourages people to leave with lighter gear, to stay out longer, and to treat later discomfort as a routine seasonal inconvenience, rather than a sign of real danger. The same historical accounts note that some duck hunters went out in short-sleeved shirts. That detail has remained attached to this storm because it captures the size of the misreading immediately. A person in short sleeves on a November hunting day is not preparing for a 70-degree drop, white-capped backwaters, and overnight ice that will delay rescue. The storm became deadlier because it drew people out under conditions that looked almost generous, then replaced those conditions so quickly that many never had time to correct for the difference. Then there was the forecast itself. This is the fourth reason, and it matters because people do not evaluate weather in a vacuum. They use forecasts as part of their judgment. The official historical summaries say the forecast called for colder temperatures and a few flurries, but the actual storm intensified into something much larger, bringing blizzard conditions, violent winds and maritime disaster. Later, Weather Service reviews also note that officials knew a storm was coming but underestimated its intensity and extent, and that this event helped drive support for keeping forecast offices staffed around the clock and improving regional forecasting responsibilities. This is important because the deadliness of a storm is shaped not only by what the atmosphere does, but by what people think the atmosphere is about to do. A forecast for colder weather and flurries leaves a room for ordinary life. A forecast for a historic storm clears the marshes and keeps some ships closer to safety. The storm became deadlier because the warning picture did not match the danger picture, and that mismatch allowed people to commit themselves to the day under assumptions that were already becoming false. The fifth reason was speed. Even a bad storm can be survived more easily if it worsens slowly enough for people to reverse course while they still have options. The Armistice Day Storm did not offer much of that generosity. It deepened rapidly as it moved northeast, and when the strong cold front passed during the late morning and early afternoon, conditions changed with unusual force. Rain turned to sleet and snow, visibility dropped, and temperatures plunged. One Weather Service account notes that in some places the temperature dropped from around 60 degrees to near freezing, and then into the single digits by the following morning. Another summary highlights the roughly 70-degree drop between Monday noon and Tuesday morning in the Winona River bottoms. That sort of collapse changes everything at once. Wet clothing becomes dangerous rather than miserable. Boat travel becomes survival travel. A failed motor or delayed return becomes more than an inconvenience. The storm became deadlier because it changed category too fast. People who were merely behind schedule by late morning could be in a life-threatening position by afternoon. A sixth reason was the Great Lakes themselves. and specifically the fact that late fall is when the lakes are especially capable of turning strong storms into larger wave events and more dangerous marine conditions. NOAAs, Great Lakes. Environmental Research Laboratory notes that most significant Great Lakes storms and large wave events happen during the colder months from late fall through winter. Late fall is also when cooler, drier air moves over relatively warmer lake water, promoting strong evaporation and helping the lakes continue interacting energetically with the atmosphere. In plain terms, November is a month when the lakes are still open, still active, still able to feed moisture and support severe wave conditions, while the broader weather pattern is becoming stronger and more winter-like. That matters because the Armistice Day Storm did not cross a dormant surface. It crossed one of the largest freshwater systems on Earth at a season when that system is especially unfriendly. The storm became deadlier because it met a setting ready to amplify wind, waves, spray, and the practical difficulty of survival, and the lakes did more than provide rough water. They also made route decisions matter in very specific ways. The Weather Service summary of the Lake Michigan disaster explains that early in the day the wind was from the southeast and increasing, which led some captains to favour the east shore. Once the wind shifted to strong southwest gales, those same vessels were trapped in an extremely dangerous position, unable to run safely before the storm and unable to face it comfortably either. That detail is one of the clearest answers to the question of why this storm became so deadly. It punished reasonable earlier decisions by changing the structure of the danger after those decisions had already been made. Mariners were not simply reckless. Many were caught in the wrong geometry once the wind shifted. The storm became deadlier because it did not just bring high waves, it changed the meaning of where ships were, which way they were heading, and what escape was still possible. A difficult lake became a lake that had closed off the safer options after men were already committed to them. This seventh reason was that the storm struck two especially vulnerable groups at once: hunters in small boats and marsh country, and mariners on the Great Lakes. These are very different kinds of exposure, but both were severe. The hunters were in open or semi-open wetlands, often in flat-bottomed boats, with limited shelter, limited communication, and clothing chosen for a mild morning. The mariners were on large water where turning around was not simple, where waves built heavily, and where wind shift could turn the route into a trap. The Weather Service summaries show how both groups were hit hard. Hundreds of hunters lost their chance to return safely when sleet, snow, and violent wind overtook them. While on Lake Michigan, the storm sank the William B. DeVock, Anna C. Minch, and Novadoc, among other losses, contributing to the 59 fatalities on that lake alone. The storm became deadlier because it did not strike only the sheltered or only the fully exposed. It found people at two different scales of vulnerability, one in small inland craft and one in commercial vessels, and it had enough force to overwhelm both. Another reason was the way the storm used ordinary human attention against itself. This may sound softer than wind speed or pressure, but it matters. The Weather Service account says that as the storm approached, masses of ducks flew low across the region, and many hunters later said they had never seen so many birds. The birds were reacting correctly to the storm. The hunters, understandably, saw an extraordinary day for hunting. That is a painful little twist, because it shows how a sign of danger became, for some, a reason to stay longer. This is not stupidity. It is the ordinary tendency to focus on the immediate purpose of the day while larger danger is still building. The storm became deadlier because it arrived under conditions that distracted people in exactly the wrong way. Hunters were not simply ignoring the sky. Many were being rewarded by the very event that was about to trap them. That delayed departure, even by a modest amount, was enough in some cases to erase the margin they needed to get back safely. Cold itself was another major reason, and perhaps the least dramatic to describe but one of the most efficient killers. Storms that sink ships or overturn boats get attention because the violence is visible. But the Armistice Day Storm also became deadlier because exposure took over once people were stranded, wet, or unable to move. The personal accounts preserved by the Weather Service are very clear about this. Survivors said that if a person fell in or got wet, he was done, and that staying dry was one of the few practical protections that made a difference. Rescue work the next morning was hindered by ice that formed overnight. Men who had escaped drowning could still freeze on islands or in river bottoms. On a lake, spray and cold reduce strength and dexterity even before catastrophe arrives. In marshes, wet clothing under plunging temperatures turns the night into a second storm after the first one. The event became deadlier because the weather did not merely strike and pass. It kept extracting heat from people for hours, including through the night, when rescue was hardest and movement was weakest. The long night is part of the answer too. Some storms kill in a burst. This one also killed by duration. People had to survive not only the front, not only the waves, not only the violent afternoon, but the entire freezing night that followed. The Weather Service's personal accounts describe men stranded until the following morning, rescue crews out through the night in undersized boats, and temperatures dropping low enough for ice to hinder operations by dawn. That extended the storm's power well beyond the dramatic hours of onset. A person who made it to an island was not necessarily safe. A ship that survived sunset was not necessarily through the worst of its work. The storm became deadlier because survival required enduring a sequence: rapid change, exposure, darkness, deep cold, delayed rescue, and then the morning count. Remove any one of those steps and the death toll might have been lower. Leave them all in place, and you have a disaster that keeps adding names after the wind's first violence is over. Scale is another answer. The same storm system hit river hunters, open lake shipping, roads, towns, farms, and transport lines over a broad region. The Weather Service summaries mention not only the human toll, but also heavy snow across Minnesota and Iowa, huge drifts, trapped motorists, livestock losses in Iowa, and more than 1 million turkeys killed across several states. That wider damage matters because it slowed response and spread resources thin. Rescue boats, roads, communications, and local manpower were all operating inside the same regional disruption. If the event had been concentrated in one harbour or one stretch of marsh, rescue might have been simpler. Instead, the storm was doing different kinds of damage in many places at once. It became deadlier because the systems people needed after the fact were themselves under stress. The same blizzard conditions that stranded hunters also slowed the people trying to reach them. The same gale that wrecked ships also made other vessels hesitate to launch. A broad storm can create isolated victims faster than a broad response can connect them. There is also a more uncomfortable reason. The event sits in that category of disaster where experience was present but not enough. Great Lakes mariners knew November weather. Hunters knew cold water and bad marsh days. Forecasters knew a storm was coming. Communities knew late autumn could turn harsh. Yet all of those kinds of knowledge were slightly outmatched at the same time. Experience tends to help people recognize familiar danger. This storm became deadlier because it exceeded familiar danger just enough and just fast enough to stay ahead of those recognitions. A captain may know rough November gales and still not have room once the wind shift changes the whole setup. A hunter may know cold, wet misery and still not have clothing or shelter for a freezing night on an island. A forecast office may know a storm is coming and still underestimate the explosive development before dawn. The deadliest events are often not the ones that meet ignorance. They are the ones that outrun competence. That is why this storm continued to matter afterward in a way ordinary bad weather did not. The National Weather Service's historical material says it strengthened support for 24-hour staffing at forecast offices and helped change how forecasting responsibilities were handled regionally. That kind of institutional response tells you the death toll was not treated as an unavoidable act of nature alone. It was understood as a lesson. The storm became the deadliest because too many things lined up. A holiday, a mild start, an understated forecast, a rapidly deepening system, a violent front, a major lake in late fall, a dangerous wind shift, too many people in exposed positions, and a long freezing night before rescue could fully begin. Put that list together, and the number 154 stops looking like a random tragedy. It starts looking like the result of a very specific chain. That is one reason the story stayed alive in newspaper archives, museum collections, and family memory. People did not remember it only because it was severe. They remembered it because in hindsight, the structure of the disaster was so stark. You can see the links now. The people inside it could only feel them closing one by one, and that may be the deepest reason of all. The Armistice Day Storm became the deadliest because it was both huge and personal. It operated at the scale of weather maps and barometric pressure, but it also reached into very small scenes. A man in a short-sleeved shirt stepping into a boat, a captain favouring the east shore under an early wind, a group of hunters watching birds fly low, rescuers pushing undersized boats into whitecaps, ice forming before daylight, families waiting for names. Some storms are remembered as systems, some are remembered as tragedies. This one became the deadliest because it managed to be both at the same time. And once a lake disaster enters memory that way, it does not leave as neatly as the storm itself did. It remains in harbours, in hunting stories, in local caution, and in the habit people around those waters developed of speaking about November with a little less confidence than they might have had before, which is where the story now drifts naturally, into the way the lake keeps such days long after the barometer recovers and the forecast has moved on. A storm map is only useful for a short time. The pressure lines move on, the front leaves the region, the warnings expire, and the official graphics are replaced by whatever weather is coming next. But places do not clear events that neatly. Communities keep dates. Families keep names. Rivers keep stories about the year the water turned bad at exactly the wrong hour. Harbours keep lists of ships that did not come back. The weather that hit on November 11th, 1940 passed, but the memory of it stayed in the upper Midwest and around the Great Lakes in a much more practical way. The National Weather Service's own historical material says the storm remained culturally important for decades, recorded in newspaper clippings, photos, museum collections, cookbooks, journal articles, and family oral traditions. It also says generations later, people still measured severe winter weather against Armistice Day 1940. That is one of the reasons the storm still feels close when you read about it now. It was not preserved only in official summaries, it was preserved in the way people talked. Someone who lived through it would not necessarily begin with barometric pressure or the exact storm track. He might begin with what he wore that morning, or how many ducks were flying low, or how hard it was to keep dry, or how the wind looked on the river by mid-afternoon. That is how memory usually works. It keeps the useful part first, and in this case the useful part was not only emotional, it was practical. Leave earlier, respect November. Do not trust a mild holiday morning too much. Keep extra layers. Keep matches dry. Remember that inland water can still behave like seawater when the wind is strong enough. The storm stayed alive because it had instruction built into it, and people tend to preserve instruction when it arrives at such cost. It also stayed alive because the event forced changes in the way weather itself was handled. Before the storm, the Weather Bureau worked in a very different world. The National Weather Service Aftermath page explains that offices in those years often operated only part of the day. Observations were limited, forecasts were brief and general, and information reached the public by newspapers, radio, telegraph, or cards posted in public buildings. There were no satellite images and very few upper-air observations. In the Midwest, one Chicago office had broad forecasting responsibility for several states. After the storm and the criticism that followed, support increased for keeping weather offices open 24 hours a day, and forecasting responsibilities were redistributed more regionally, so local centres could issue timelier predictions. In other words, the storm was remembered not only by the people who feared it, but by the institutions that had to admit they had not seen enough of it soon enough. That kind of institutional memory matters because it shows the storm did not become a legend by accident. It was studied, argued over, and folded back into daily practice. The aftermath page is remarkably direct about one of the most embarrassing revelations. According to a retired government forecaster cited there, no one was watching the storm's explosive development in the pre-dawn hours of November 11th, because the Midwest headquarters in Chicago was not staffed overnight. That is a hard fact to sit with, and people did sit with it. They sat with it in weather offices, in newspapers, in town conversations, and no doubt at a great many kitchen tables where grief and anger were living side by side. The lake, the marshes and the roads had already shown what the storm could do. Afterward, the Weather Service had to decide what to do with what it had learned. The answer was not to forget, but to reorganise. A storm becomes part of institutional memory when it leaves behind procedures as well as graves. The public memory settled in even deeper because the event spread across so many parts of ordinary life. The same official aftermath source says the Armistice Day Storm remained the second most requested bit of information from the Minnesota State Climatologist Office decades later, and it notes that in Iowa the event was severe enough to help change agricultural practice, with some apple growers switching toward corn and soybean production. A Minnesota State Climatology page still ranks the 1940 Armistice Day blizzard as number 2 among the state's top 5 weather events of the 20th century, and says that many Minnesotans born before 1940 could tell you where they were when it happened. That is what it means for an event to move beyond weather and into regional identity. It becomes a benchmark. It becomes one of the dates older people use when comparing storms. It becomes the answer when somebody says this one is bad, and somebody else says yes, but do you remember? Or did your father ever tell you about November 11th, 1940? There is also a difference between remembering a storm and remembering the lake. Storms are dates. Lakes are presences. A storm arrives, does its work, and leaves. A lake remains there afterward, looking respectable again by the next season, as if it had not spent one day in 1940 wrecking ships and trapping hunters. That is why Great Lakes memory often settles into local caution rather than continuous drama. People keep working, they keep shipping, they keep hunting, they keep living around the water, but the memory stays in the habits. NOAA's Great Lakes and Sanctuary programs now preserve and interpret maritime history in ways that make that caution visible. Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary protects nearly 100 historic shipwrecks in Lake Huron and pairs research with education and community involvement. Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary, designated in 2021, provides stewardship for maritime heritage in Lake Michigan and protects 36 historic shipwreck sites, with research suggesting many more remain to be found. The point is not that every wreck belongs to the Armistice Day Storm. It is that the lakes keep enough wrecks, enough names, and enough stories that no one around them can pretend the past was exaggerated. That physical side of memory is important. A family story can fade. A newspaper can yellow in a drawer. But a wreck on the lake bed is stubborn. It is still there whether anyone visits it or not. It gives the past weight. NOAA's Educational Shipwreck background page notes that the Great Lakes Maritime Collection is a public archival collection dedicated to Great Lakes maritime history, containing thousands of resources documenting the history and heritage of these inland seas. That tells you something useful about how the region has chosen to remember itself. The memory is not being left to rumour alone. It is archived, catalogued, displayed, and revisited. The Great Lakes Maritime Heritage Centre in Alpena, for example, invites visitors to experience a life-size schooner deck and exhibits about shipwreck history and storms. A place like that is not merely a museum in the ordinary sense. It is part of the practical work of keeping the lakes honest about what they have done. The storm also remained vivid because the personal accounts are unusually strong. The National Weather Service's archive of recollections does not read like distant folklore. It reads like people who still know exactly how cold their hands were. One survivor remembered ice welding his sock to the accelerator pedal as he drove home. Another remembered the next morning's rescue, the 70-degree temperature drop from the previous noon, and the fact that 50 freezing men still awaited help in the Winona River bottoms. Oscar Girth remembered that anyone who fell in or got wet was in terrible danger, and that he survived partly by keeping his clothing dry. He also remembered chopping up handmade cedar decoys to burn through the night. Max Conrad's dawn flight on November 12th stayed in those accounts too, because survivors saw him overhead, low enough to search for men under tipped-over boats. These are not decorative stories attached later to make the event sound richer. They are the event, carried forward in a human voice, and because those voices survived, the storm never became only a set of official totals. People still knew it as the day when the ducks came low and the hunters stayed out too long. The day when the weather started in shirt sleeves and ended in ice. The day when rescue crews in small boats had to push into water too rough for the boats they had. The day when 5 men died in one local warden's patrol area, or when 17 stranded hunters survived because they had enough people and enough wood to keep a fire going until daylight. The Personal Accounts Archive even notes that newspapers from around the country sent reporters to the Mississippi River towns to cover what had happened. That widened the memory quickly. It was not only local grief, it was national news, and the prose of the time leaned hard into heroism, tragedy and warning, because the facts themselves already supported all three. There is something else about lake memory that is worth noticing. It does not require everybody to know the exact details. Plenty of people around the Great Lakes probably could not tell you the precise pressure reading at Houghton or the full list of vessels lost off Pentwater, but they may still carry a simpler inheritance, a careful tone when discussing November, a habit of checking the forecast twice, a story from a grandfather about a storm that arrived too fast, or a local phrase about not underestimating the lakes. The National Weather Service Aftermath page says, events with the potential for folklore produce social impact, and that the consequences can change how people live, work, play, and organise themselves. That may sound academic on the page, but in plain life it means habits. It means one generation quietly hands a little extra caution to the next. The weather forgets because it has no reason to remember. People remember because memory is one of the tools they use to stay alive. It helps too that the Great Lakes are the kind of place where memory can be refreshed by the season itself. Every year November comes back. Every year the air turns harder. The tourist softness thins out. The harbours look more serious, and the idea of a gale of November stops sounding literary and starts sounding practical again. NOAA's Great Lakes. Research notes that late fall and winter are when most of the lake's significant storms and large wave events occur, so the region gets annual reminders. The season itself points backward. A person does not need to be reading a history book to feel that something about late autumn on these waters deserves respect. The lake reminds him in the way it looks, in the way the wind carries over open water, and in the way every local person with enough years behind them seems to become a little more exacting about weather once summer has truly left. That may be why the Armistice Day Storm still sits in such a sturdy place in public memory, even beside other famous Great Lakes disasters. The lakes have had many wrecks. They have taken many ships. Their history is full of storms severe enough to become local reference points. Yet the 1940 storm stands out because it did not belong only to mariners. It belonged to hunters, farmers, motorists, rescuers, forecasters and town newspapers too. It spread itself across work, recreation, travel and weather practice all at once. The National Weather Service's historical pages return to that breadth over and over again. 154 deaths overall, shipwrecks on Lake Michigan, duck hunters frozen on islands, roads shut down, heavy losses to livestock and poultry, and forecasting reforms afterward. It was too broad to stay tucked into one profession's memory. The whole region had to carry it, and this is where the title really earns itself in the plainest possible way. The weather forgets because it is always busy making new weather. It has no shelf for old mistakes. It does not sit around considering the way a mild morning fooled hundreds of people, or how a forecast that sounded manageable became part of a death toll. or how men on the east side of Lake Michigan found themselves trapped by a wind shift. It simply moves on to the next front, the next low, the next lake effect band, the next winter map. But the lake and the communities around it keep records in more stubborn forms. There are archives, there are museums, there are sanctuaries, there are family stories that get a little shorter every generation, but keep the important parts. There are dates on memorials, names in old newspapers, and practical lessons hidden inside ordinary advice. There is even the shape of the shoreline itself, which many people know differently after they have spent enough years hearing what happened there in 1940. The stories preserved by the Weather Service show this especially well. They are not polished monuments, they are working memories. A man remembers that his father was listening to the radio when he failed to come home on time. Another remembers not having a boat big enough for the waves. Another remembers carrying a half-frozen hunter back towards safety. Another remembers seeing Max Conrad overhead and understanding for a moment that rescue was possible. When memories remain that concrete, they continue doing useful work. They resist the tempting modern habit of treating old disasters as if the people in them were somehow more careless or less informed than we are. In fact, the stories make the opposite point. They show ordinary people making ordinary decisions under changing information, and then trying, with remarkable stubbornness, to save one another once the day went wrong. That is one reason the event has lasted. It contains warning, but it also contains conduct. So what remains after the storm really is not one single memory. It is a layered one. The official weather memory says staffing changed, forecasts changed, regional responsibilities changed. The local civic memory says this town lost hunters, that harbour lost a ship. This newspaper devoted its front page to the storm. The family memory says your grandfather never trusted a warm November morning again, or always carried extra matches, or always talked about the birds flying low before the front. The lake memory is different still. It is less verbal. It sits in wreck sites, in sanctuaries, in museum exhibits, in archival collections, and in the simple fact that these waters continue to ask for respect every cold season. Taken together, those layers explain why the Armistice Day Storm has not slipped into the polite fog that covers many old events. It remains sharp where it matters, and perhaps that is the calmest way to leave it. Not with thunder, not with a final shout from the weather, because the weather itself was finished long ago. Better to leave it where the people around the lakes left it, as a date that still means something, as a warning folded into local common sense, as a storm important enough to change forecasts and ordinary enough to survive in family talk. Somewhere in the upper Midwest there are still drawers with clippings, albums with photographs, and older voices that can tell the story without checking a book. Somewhere along the lakes visitors still walk into heritage centres, look at names and wrecks, and understand that fresh water can hold maritime grief just as firmly as any ocean. And somewhere tonight, if there is a little wind outside where you are, it is only wind. You're not in a blind or on a freighter deck, or waiting on an island for first light. You are here, warm and dry, while the long record of that storm stays where it belongs now, in memory, in caution, and in the quiet way the lake keeps teaching the same lesson to anyone willing to listen.